It's strange how we often take the things closest to us for granted, assuming they'll always be there, unchanged, unbroken. That's how I used to think about my family, a blended but seemingly perfect family. My dad, Richard, had built a stable, loving home after my mom passed away. He met Laura, a woman who, on the surface, seemed to complete our world. She was charming, warm, and caring, or at least that's what we all thought. Laura wasn't just my stepmother. She became a friend, someone who seemed to care deeply about everyone in the family. My stepbrothers, Ethan and Liam, adored her. Ethan, 22, was the charismatic one, confident and outgoing, the kind of guy everyone wanted to be around. Liam, 19, was quieter, more reserved, but with a kindness that made him easy to love. Together, we all fit into this picture of a modern, happy family. Looking back now, I can see how blind we all were. The cracks were always there. Subtle, almost invisible, but at the time none of us noticed. Or maybe we just didn't want to. At first, everything seemed normal. We'd have family dinners filled with laughter, movie nights where we'd all pile onto the couch, and holidays that felt magical. Laura was the glue that held it all together. She had this way of making everyone feel special, like we were all important to her in different ways. But now, I realized that wasn't love, it was control. The first time I noticed something strange, it was so small I almost ignored it. It was during one of our family dinners. Ethan made a joke, and Laura laughed a little too hard. Her laugh wasn't the problem. It was the way she looked at him. It wasn't the kind of look a mother gives her son. It was something else, something I couldn't quite place. I shook it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. Laura was a loving stepmom, and Ethan was always good at making people laugh. But as the days turned into weeks, I started to notice more. Little things. Things that didn't add up. There was the way Laura would touch Ethan's arm when she walked by. The lingering glances they'd share when they thought no one was looking. And then there was Liam. He was always a little shy, but lately he seemed different. Nervous, quiet. He'd avoid Laura's gaze entirely, like he was afraid of something. One afternoon, I was in the living room reading a book when I heard laughter coming from the kitchen. It was Laura and Ethan. They were standing close, too close. She reached out to brush something off his shirt, and for a moment, their eyes locked in a way that made my stomach turn. Ethan noticed me standing there and immediately stepped back. Laura, as always, played it off with a laugh, but something about that moment stuck with me. I started paying more attention after that. I noticed how Laura would spend more time in the boys' rooms, under the guise of helping them with homework or fixing something. I'd see her leaning in close to whisper something to Ethan, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. And then there were the late-night talks. I'd hear her voice through the thin walls, always in hushed tones, but never loud enough to make out the words. It wasn't just Ethan, though. Liam was acting strangely, too. He started avoiding family dinners, saying he wasn't hungry or that he had too much schoolwork. When he was around, he'd barely speak, and when Laura was in the room, he'd practically shrink into himself. It was like he was carrying some invisible weight, and I couldn't understand why. I tried talking to my dad about it once. We were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset, and I told him I felt like something was off. I didn't mention Laura or the boys. I didn't have the courage for that, but I said I felt like we weren't as close as we used to be. He smiled and said it was just part of growing up, that blended families take time to settle. He had so much faith in Laura, in the life they'd built together. I didn't have the heart to push him. The more I watched, the more the pieces started to fall into place. But it wasn't until I overheard a conversation between Laura and Ethan that my suspicions turned into something more. It was late one evening, and I was walking down the hallway when I heard their voices coming from the kitchen. They were arguing about something, about being more careful. I didn't hear all the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Urgency, secrecy, and something else I couldn't quite name. Looking back now, I see how blind I was, how blind we all were. The perfect family I thought we had was nothing more than an illusion. And the things I was about to uncover would change everything. They would destroy the very foundation of what I thought family meant. I didn't know it then, But the secrets were already starting to unravel. The lies Laura had built her life around were about to come crashing down. And when they did, none of us would ever be the same. It's strange how the things you ignore start to pile up. Looking back, I realize those small, odd moments weren't isolated. They were part of a larger picture, one I was too blind to see at the time. The perfect family I thought we had was starting to crack, and I was about to fall right through the gaps. It started with Laura. She was always the picture of grace, poised, confident, and endlessly supportive. But lately there was something different about her. She seemed restless, almost distracted. She'd be in the middle of a conversation and suddenly trail off, her green eyes distant as if she were somewhere else entirely. Then there was Ethan. He was the golden boy, the one who could do no wrong. But lately his charm seemed forced, like he was trying too hard to keep up appearances. He started spending more time at home, which was unusual for him. Ethan was always out with friends, always the life of the party. Now he was here, lingering in the kitchen or sitting too close to Laura on the couch. I told myself it was harmless, just a stepson and stepmother getting along well. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. And Liam. Liam was the hardest to read. He was quieter than usual, withdrawn. He'd avoid eye contact whenever Laura was around, his light brown eyes darting nervously like he was afraid of being caught. It wasn't like him. Liam was always the one who'd sit with me and talk about school or the books he was reading. But now, it felt like he was carrying some secret burden he couldn't share. One evening, I walked into the kitchen to grab a glass of water. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're intruding on something. I heard voices, Laura and Ethan, talking in hushed tones. I couldn't make out the words, but their tone was urgent, almost conspiratorial. When I stepped into the room, they both froze. Laura quickly plastered on a smile, her laugh too loud and too forced as she said something about needing Ethan's help with a recipe. Ethan wouldn't even look at me. He just mumbled something and walked out of the room. That moment stuck with me. It wasn't just the awkwardness. It was the way Laura looked at me, like she was daring me to question her. It sent a shiver down my spine. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention. I noticed how Laura and Ethan seemed to have their own unspoken language. A shared glance here, a subtle touch there. It was all so quick, so subtle, but once I started noticing it, I couldn't stop. And then there was Liam. He'd disappear for hours at a time, always claiming he was busy with schoolwork, but his nervous energy gave him away. He was hiding something and I couldn't figure out what. One afternoon, I decided to clean the living room while Laura was out. It wasn't unusual for her to leave her things lying around. Magazines, a scarf, sometimes her phone. But that day I found something that made my heart stop. Tucked between the cushions of the couch was a small piece of paper. It was folded neatly, almost like someone had placed it there intentionally. When I opened it, my stomach dropped. It was a note, handwritten, and it wasn't addressed to my dad. It read, "I can't stop thinking about you. Last night was incredible." There was no name, just a small heart drawn at the bottom. I told myself it could have been old. Maybe it was from before Laura married my dad. But deep down I knew that wasn't true. The handwriting was fresh, the ink still bold. And the way Laura and Ethan had been acting lately. It all started to make sense. But what about Liam? Where did he fit into all of this? I didn't have answers, only more questions. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece it all together. I thought about confronting Laura, but what would I even say? I had no proof, no concrete evidence. Just a feeling, a suspicion that something was terribly wrong. And then there was my dad. He trusted Laura completely. How could I tell him what I'd found? What I thought was happening? The next morning I tried to act normal. I joined the family for breakfast, forcing myself to smile and laugh along with everyone else. But the tension in the room was unbearable. Laura seemed calm, even cheerful, but her green eyes flicked to me more than once, like she knew I'd found something. Ethan was quieter than usual. his gaze fixed on his plate. And Liam wouldn't even sit at the table. He grabbed a plate of food and took it to his room, muttering something about needing to study. It felt like we were all living in the same house but in completely different worlds. I knew I couldn't keep ignoring it. Whatever was happening, it wasn't going away. And the more I watched, the more I realized that the cracks in our perfect family weren't just cracks. They were fault lines ready to split us apart. I just didn't know how deep they went, or how much damage they would cause when they finally broke open. I thought I was prepared for the truth, but nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to uncover. The secrets, the lies, they were bigger than I ever imagined. And they were about to destroy everything. After finding that note, everything felt different. Every glance, every word, every interaction, it all seemed loaded with hidden meanings. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Who had written it? And, more importantly, who was it meant for? I tried to convince myself it wasn't what it seemed, but deep down I knew better. The perfect family I thought we had was slipping away, and I was the only one who seemed to notice. Laura was good at pretending. She'd always been good at it. At breakfast the next morning, she was her usual cheerful self, pouring coffee, asking about our plans for the day. But there was something in her eyes, a sharpness that wasn't there before. It was like she knew I was starting to see through her, and she was daring me to say something. Ethan, on the other hand, couldn't meet my gaze. He spent the entire meal staring at his phone, his jaw tight, while Liam barely said a word, his plate untouched. I couldn't let it go. That note was proof that something wasn't right. I wanted to confront Laura, to demand answers, but I didn't know how. What if I was wrong? What if I accused her of something and ended up tearing the family apart for no reason? And then there was my dad. He loved Laura. He trusted her completely. How could I tell him that the woman he'd built his life around might not be who she seemed? That evening, I decided to do something I'd never done before. I went into Laura's room while she was out. It felt wrong, like I was invading her privacy, but I couldn't ignore the feeling in my gut. I needed answers. Her room was immaculate, everything in its place. But as I opened the drawers and searched through her belongings, I found nothing out of the ordinary. Just clothes, jewelry, and a few books. I was about to give up when I noticed her phone on the bedside table. It was locked, of course, but something about it made my stomach churn. What was I even looking for? A text? Photo? I didn't know, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I needed to know was in that phone. The next day, I tried to act normal. I went about my routine, but my mind was elsewhere. I kept replaying the moment I found that note, wondering if I should have kept it. Maybe then I'd have something concrete, something I could use to confront her. But I hadn't. I'd been too scared, too unsure of what it would mean if I was right. Laura, as always, was perfect. She greeted me with a warm smile, asked about my day, and even offered to help me with a project I was working on. It was almost enough to make me doubt myself, to make me believe that I was imagining things. But then Ethan walked into the room, and everything shifted. He froze when he saw Laura, his blue eyes flicking to mine for a split second before looking away. Laura's smile faltered for just a moment, but it was enough. The tension between them was palpable, and it made my chest tighten. Later that evening, I found myself standing outside Ethan's room. I could hear voices, his and Laura's, talking in low tones. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was intimate, almost conspiratorial. My heart raced as I pressed my ear to the door, trying to catch even a fragment of their conversation. But before I could hear anything, the door opened, and I stumbled back, my face burning with embarrassment. Ethan stared at me, his expression unreadable. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice sharp. I stammered something about looking for a charger, avoiding his gaze. Laura appeared behind him, her green eyes calm but cold. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice sweet but laced with an edge I couldn't ignore. I nodded quickly and walked away, my heart pounding in my chest. That moment confirmed what I'd been trying so hard to deny. Something was happening between them, and it wasn't innocent. Over the next few days, I started to notice more. Laura's hand lingering on Ethan's arm during a conversation. The way his gaze would linger on her when he thought no one was looking. The secretive glances they shared. The whispers I couldn't quite catch. It was all so subtle, so carefully hidden. But now that I was looking for it, I couldn't unsee it. Liam, too, seemed to be withdrawing even more. He avoided Laura entirely, making excuses to leave the room whenever she entered. I couldn't understand it. Was he jealous? Did he know what was going on? Or was there something else? Something I hadn't uncovered yet. One evening I decided to talk to Liam. I knocked on his door and after a long pause, he opened it, his face pale and drawn. "Can we talk?" I asked. He hesitated before nodding and stepping aside to let me in. His room was neat, almost eerily so, like he'd been trying to distract himself by cleaning. I sat on the edge of his bed, unsure of how to start. "Is everything okay?" I asked finally. He shrugged, avoiding my gaze. "I'm fine," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I didn't press him. Not yet. But as I left his room that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that Liam knew more than he was letting on. And I couldn't ignore the growing knot in my stomach, the sense that our family was balancing on the edge of a cliff, about to fall apart. I didn't have all the answers yet, but I was getting closer. The cracks in our perfect family were growing wider, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. I just didn't realize how devastating the truth would be. The tension in our house was becoming unbearable. Every interaction felt like a game of pretend, each of us playing our roles while silently battling our own secrets. Laura was as radiant as ever, her perfect smile and graceful demeanor masking whatever was brewing beneath the surface. Ethan and Liam, once so carefree, now carried a heaviness that seemed to grow with each passing day. And then there was me, caught in the middle, desperate to understand what was tearing our family apart. I started noticing the whispered conversations more and more. They always seemed to happen when Laura thought no one was around. Late at night, I'd hear her voice, low and urgent, coming from behind closed doors. Sometimes it was Ethan she was talking to, other times Liam. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, secretive, almost intimate. It sent chills down my spine. One night I couldn't take it anymore. I heard her in the kitchen talking to someone. The house was dark, and the faint glow from the kitchen light spilled into the hallway. I crept closer, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached the doorway, I saw her, Laura, standing with Ethan. They were standing close, their heads bent together as they whispered. Her hand rested lightly on his arm, and he looked down at her. His expression conflicted. I froze, unsure of what to do. Should I confront them? Demand to know what was going on? But before I could decide, Laura turned and saw me. For a moment, her green eyes flashed with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, anger, maybe both. But then she smiled, that perfect practice smile. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, her voice light and casual. Ethan stepped back quickly, his face a mask of indifference. I mumbled something about getting water and hurried away, my mind racing. That encounter left me shaken. It wasn't just what I saw. It was the way Laura looked at me, like she knew I was starting to put the pieces together. And Ethan? He couldn't even meet my eyes. It was like he was ashamed or maybe afraid of what I might say. I didn't know what to do. I felt like I was drowning in questions, and every answer I found only led to more. A few days later, I overheard another conversation, this time between Laura and Liam. It was late in the afternoon, and I was in my room with the door slightly ajar. Their voices drifted up the stairs, low and urgent. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught enough to send a shiver down my spine. "You can't keep avoiding me," Laura said, her tone sharp. "It's not good for any of us." Liam's response was quieter, almost pleading. "I don't know if I can do this anymore," he said. "It's too much." There was a pause, and then Laura's voice softened. "You don't have to do it alone," she said. "We'll figure it out. Together." The words hung in the air like a shadow, heavy and unsettling. I stayed frozen in place, my heart racing as I tried to make sense of what I'd just heard. That conversation confirmed what I'd been afraid of. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just about Ethan. Liam was involved too. But how? And why? The questions swirled in my mind, each one more unsettling than the last. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into an abyss I didn't want to fall into. I decided to confront Liam. I waited until later that evening when Laura was out, and the house was quiet. I knocked on his door, and after a long pause, he opened it, his face pale and drawn. "Can we talk?" "Yes." He hesitated before nodding and stepping aside to let me in. His room was tidy, almost unnervingly so, like he'd been trying to distract himself by organizing everything. I sat on the edge of his bed, unsure of how to start. "Is everything okay?" asked finally. He shrugged, avoiding my gaze. "I'm fine," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I pressed on, my voice softer. "Liam, I know something's going on. You've been acting different and I just want to help." His shoulders tensed, and for a moment I thought he was going to open up. But then he shook his head. "You wouldn't understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I left his room feeling more confused than ever. Whatever Liam was hiding, it was tearing him apart. And then there was Laura. She had a way of controlling the narrative, of making everyone around her feel like she was the glue holding us together. But now I was starting to see the cracks. And I was terrified of what lay beneath them. The next morning I tried to act normal, but the tension in the house was palpable. Laura greeted me with her usual warmth, but her green eyes seemed sharper, more watchful. Ethan was quieter than usual, his blue eyes downcast as he picked at his breakfast. Liam barely said a word, his gaze fixed on his plate. It felt like we were all pretending, each of us playing our roles in this twisted play Laura had orchestrated. I knew I was getting closer to the truth, but every step forward felt like walking deeper into a dark forest. The secrets I was uncovering were bigger than I'd imagined, and I was starting to realize that once they came to light, there would be no going back. It was getting harder to keep pretending that everything was normal. The air in our house felt heavy, like a storm waiting to break. Every glance, every word, every silence, it all seemed loaded with meaning. And I was stuck in the middle, watching my family unravel without knowing how to stop it. Laura's smile had become a weapon, masking whatever game she was playing. Ethan's charm had faded into nervous tension, and Liam seemed like a shadow of himself. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening, it was bigger than I realized. The whispered conversations, the stolen glances, the strange tension that hung over every meal, it all felt connected. But the more I tried to make sense of it, the more tangled it became. And then one night everything changed. It was late, past midnight, and the house was quiet. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. My mind kept circling back to Laura, Ethan, and Liam, to the secrets I could feel pressing against the walls of our home. And then I heard it. Voices, low and urgent, coming from downstairs. I got out of bed and crept to the top of the stairs, my heart pounding. The voices were coming from the living room. I couldn't make out every word, but I caught enough to send a chill through me. "You can't keep acting like this," Laura said, her voice sharp but hushed. "Do you want to ruin everything?" Ethan's response was quieter, but I could hear the frustration in his tone. "I'm not the one making this complicated," he said. "You are." There was a pause, and then Laura's voice softened, almost pleading. "You know what this means to me. Plus, we can't let her find out. Or, were they talking about me?" My chest tightened as I leaned closer, straining to hear. But before I could catch any more, the voices stopped. I heard footsteps, and I quickly retreated to my room, my heart racing. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just a suspicion anymore. It was real, and it was dangerous. The next morning, I couldn't look at Laura without hearing her voice in my head. The way she'd pleaded with Ethan, the urgency in her tone. It was all wrong. But Laura, as always, was perfect. She moved through the kitchen with her usual grace, making breakfast and chatting with my dad as if nothing had happened. Ethan, on the other hand, was a mess. He barely touched his food, his blue eyes darting between Laura and the floor. And Liam didn't even come downstairs. I decided to check on him later that day. His door was closed, and when I knocked, it took him a long time to answer. When he finally opened it, he looked exhausted. His light brown eyes were red-rimmed, like he hadn't slept, and his usually neat room was a mess. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice flat. I hesitated, unsure of how to start. I just wanted to see if you were okay," I said. He laughed bitterly, a sound that didn't suit him. "Do I look okay?" I stepped inside and sat on the edge of his bed, unsure of what to say. "Liam, if something's wrong you can talk to me," I said softly. He shook his head, his jaw tightening. "You wouldn't understand," he muttered. Pressed on, my voice firmer. "Try me." He didn't answer, just stared at the floor, his hands clenched into fists. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. Finally he looked up at me. His eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. Anger, fear, maybe both. "It's not what you think," he said finally. "But it's bad. Really bad." My heart sank at his words. I wanted to ask more, to demand answers, but the look on his face stopped me. He was on the edge, and I knew that pushing him would only make things worse. So I nodded and left, my mind racing. Whatever Liam was hiding, it was tied to Laura and Ethan. And whatever it was tearing him apart. That evening, I found myself in the kitchen with Laura. My dad was working late, and Ethan and Liam had disappeared to their rooms. It was just the two of us, and the silence was unbearable. I watched her as she cleaned up, her movements smooth and practiced. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Laura," I said, my voice steady, "is everything okay?" She turned to me, her green eyes narrowing slightly. "Of course," she said, her smile calm but tight. "Why wouldn't it be?" I hesitated, searching her face for any sign of the truth. "I don't know," I said finally. "It just feels like something's off." Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second before returning, brighter than ever. "You're imagining things," she said lightly, turning back to the sink. But her hands were trembling, and I knew I wasn't imagining anything. The next few days passed in a blur of tension and unease. I tried to talk to my dad again, but he was so busy with work that I didn't have the heart to burden him. Laura continued to act as if everything was fine, but I could see the cracks forming in her perfect facade. And Ethan and Liam. They were drifting further apart, each retreating into their own guilt and fear. And then late one night I heard it again. Voices. This time it was louder, angrier. I crept downstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached the living room I saw them, Laura, Ethan and Liam. They were arguing, their voices overlapping in a chaotic mix of accusations and pleas. I couldn't make out every word, but one phrase cut through the noise like a knife. "She's going to find out." They didn't see me standing there, frozen in the shadows. But in that moment, I realized the truth was closer than ever. And whatever it was about to destroy us all. It felt like I was living in a house of mirrors, where nothing was as it seemed. Every word, every glance, every silence felt loaded with meaning, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. The confrontation I'd overheard between Laura, Ethan, and Liam had left me shaken. "She's going to find out," they'd said. Were they talking about me? Was I the one they were trying to keep in the dark? And if so, why? Over the next few days, the tension in the house became unbearable. Laura moved through the rooms with her usual elegance, but there was a sharpness to her smile now, a brittle edge that hadn't been there before. Ethan avoided me altogether, his blue eyes downcast whenever I entered the room. And Liam seemed lost, retreating further into himself until it felt like he wasn't even there anymore. I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer. The truth was hiding in plain sight, and it was time for me to find it. I decided to confront Ethan first. I waited until late in the evening, when Laura had gone to bed, and knocked on his door. When he opened it, his expression was guarded, his jaw tight. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice low and wary. I hesitated, searching his face for any sign of the boy I used to know. "We need to talk," I said finally. He stepped aside, letting me in, but his posture was stiff, his body language screaming discomfort. I sat down on the edge of his bed, my heart pounding. "Ethan, I know something's going on," I said, my voice steady but soft. "And I think it has to do with Laura." His reaction was immediate. A sharp intake of breath, his blue eyes widening for a split second before narrowing. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, his tone defensive. But the tremor in his voice betrayed him. I pressed on, refusing to back down. "I've seen the way you look at her," I said. "I've heard the conversations. And I found the note." At that, his face went pale, his lips parting as if to speak, but no words came out. For a moment, he just stared at me, his defenses crumbling. "It's not what you think," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. But there was no conviction in his words, and we both knew it. Before I could say anything else, Ethan stood abruptly, pacing the room like a caged animal. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rising. "It's not that simple." I stood too, my frustration boiling over. "Then explain it to me," I demanded. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're hiding something that could destroy this family." He stopped pacing, his shoulders slumping as he turned to face me. "It's already destroyed," he said, his voice hollow. "You just don't know it yet." His words left me reeling. I wanted to push him for more, to make him tell me everything, but he shook his head, his eyes pleading. "Don't do this, Linda," he said. "Just leave it alone." But how could I? How could I walk away when the truth was so close, so tantalizingly out of reach? I left his room that night with more questions than answers, my mind racing as I tried to piece it all together. The next morning, I decided to confront Laura. I found her in the kitchen, sipping her coffee as if she didn't have a care in the world. But as I entered the room, her green eyes flicked to mine, sharp and calculating. "Good morning," she said, her tone warm but distant. I didn't respond, didn't even sit down. Instead, I stood across from her, my arms crossed. "We need to talk," I said. Laura raised an eyebrow, her expression calm but watchful. "About what?" she asked. I hesitated, my heart pounding, but I forced myself to meet her gaze. "About Ethan. And Liam." For a moment, her mask slipped. Her eyes widened just a fraction, but it was enough. She quickly recovered, setting her coffee cup down with a soft clink. "I don't know what you're implying," she said, her voice icy now. "But I suggest you tread carefully." Her words sent a chill through me, but I didn't back down. "I've seen the way you act around them," I said. "I've heard the whispers. You're hiding something, Laura, and I'm going to find out what it is." She didn't respond, just stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Finally, she stood, smoothing her dress with deliberate precision. "You're playing a dangerous game, Linda," she said quietly. "Be careful you don't get burned." With that, she walked out of the room, leaving me standing there, shaken but more determined than ever. That evening, I tried to talk to Liam again. I found him sitting in the backyard, staring at the sky, his shoulders slumped. He didn't look up as I approached, didn't react when I sat down beside him. "Liam," I said softly, "I need you to be honest with me. What's going on?" He didn't answer, didn't even look at me. But then, after a long silence, he spoke, his voice barely audible. "It's not just Ethan," he said. "It's me too." His words hit me like a freight train, the weight of them knocking the air from my lungs. It wasn't just Ethan. It was Liam too. And as the truth started to unravel, I realized I was standing on the edge of a precipice, staring into an abyss I couldn't escape. Liam's words echoed in my mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. "It's not just Ethan. It's me too." I couldn't believe it, didn't want to believe it. But the look on his face, the weight in his voice, left no room for doubt. This wasn't just about Ethan and Laura. It was something far more twisted. My stepmom had entangled herself in both of my stepbrothers' lives in ways I couldn't begin to fathom. And now, the perfect family I thought I had was crumbling before my eyes. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, staring at Liam, trying to process what he'd just said. He wouldn't look at me, his gaze fixed on the ground. His body tense like he was bracing for a storm. Finally I found my voice. "Liam," I said, my tone trembling. "What are you talking about? What do you mean it's you two?" He didn't answer, didn't even move. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating, until finally, he whispered, "You don't want to know." But I did. Had to. "I need you to tell me," I pressed, my voice firmer now. "Whatever's going on, we can't keep pretending it doesn't exist." He shook his head, his light brown eyes filling with tears. "You don't get it," he said. "If you knew, you'd never look at me the same way again." My heart ached at his words, but they only made me more determined. "Liam," I said softly, "I'll always be your sister. Whatever this is, we'll figure it out. Together." He looked at me then, his expression a mix of fear and desperation. For a moment I thought he was going to tell me everything. But instead he stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the ground. "I can't do this," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry." And with that, he walked away, leaving me alone with the weight of his confession. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd just heard. If Liam was involved too, what did that mean? How far had this gone? And how long had it been happening? The next morning, the tension in the house was unbearable. Laura moved through the kitchen with her usual poise, but there was a sharpness in her movements, a subtle edge that hadn't been there before. Ethan barely touched his breakfast, his blue eyes darting to Laura every few seconds, while Liam avoided the table altogether. My dad, oblivious as always, chatted about work, completely unaware of the storm brewing around him. I could feel Laura's gaze on me as I sipped my coffee, her green eyes watching me like a hawk. She knew I was getting closer to the truth, and she was waiting for me to make my move. And then it happened. I didn't mean to confront her in front of everyone, but the words spilled out before I could stop them. "Laura," I said, my voice cutting through the room, "we need to talk." My dad looked up, startled, while Ethan froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. Laura raised an eyebrow, her expression calm but guarded. "Of course," she said smoothly. "What's on your mind?" I hesitated, my heart pounding as the weight of the moment pressed down on me. "I know something's going on," I said finally. "And I think it's time we stop pretending everything is fine." My dad frowned, confusion flickering across his face. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his tone filled with concern. Laura smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Linda," she said gently, "I think you've been under a lot of stress lately. Maybe you're overthinking things." Her words lit a fire in me. "Don't do that," I snapped. "Don't pretend like I'm imagining this. I've seen the way you act around Ethan. And Liam." The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. Ethan's fork clattered to his plate, his blue eyes wide with panic. My dad looked from me to Laura, his confusion deepening. "What is she talking about?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Laura didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stood, smoothing her dress with deliberate precision. "I think you need to calm down, Linda," she said, her tone cool and measured. But her calm facade only fueled my anger. "Don't talk to me like I'm crazy," I said, my voice shaking. "I'm not the one hiding secrets." My dad stood then, his brow furrowed as he looked at Laura. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice firmer now. "Is there something I need to know?" Laura's mask slipped then, just for a moment. Her green eyes flicked to Ethan, then to Liam, who had appeared in the doorway, his face pale and drawn. For a second no one spoke, the silence stretching until it felt like the walls were closing in. And then Laura smiled, a sharp, cold smile that sent chills down my spine. "Be careful, Linda," she said softly. "You're treading on dangerous ground." Her words hung in the air, a warning and a threat all at once. My dad turned to me, his expression a mix of confusion and concern. "Linda," he said, "what's going on?" But I couldn't answer. My heart was pounding, my mind racing as I tried to process what had just happened. Laura had always been the picture of perfection, the glue that held our family together. But now I was starting to see the cracks, and they were spreading fast. I didn't have all the answers yet, but I knew one thing for sure. The illusion of our perfect family was shattered. And the truth that lay beneath it was darker and more twisted than I could have ever imagined. The tension after the breakfast confrontation lingered like a heavy cloud. My dad, Richard, had brushed it off, chalking my words up to a misunderstanding. Laura, as always, had managed to smooth things over with her charm, turning my accusations into something trivial. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the verge of uncovering something far darker than I had imagined. That evening the house was eerily quiet. Ethan and Liam had retreated to their rooms, avoiding me and each other, while Laura pretended nothing was amiss. I sat in the living room, scrolling aimlessly on my phone, trying to make sense of everything. My mind kept circling back to Liam's words. "It's not just Ethan. It's me too." What did that even mean? And why had he looked so broken when he said it? I couldn't let it go. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the picture they painted was one I didn't want to see. Laura had somehow woven herself into both Ethan and Liam's lives in ways that went far beyond a stepmother's role. The question was, how far had it gone, and how long had it been happening? Later that night, I decided to take a walk through the house, hoping the silence would give me some clarity. As I passed by Ethan's room, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. I hesitated, then peeked inside. He wasn't there. His bed was unmade, and his jacket was missing from the chair. My stomach tightened. Where had he gone so late at night? I moved down the hallway toward Liam's room, but his door was closed. I paused, listening for any sound, but there was nothing. The entire house felt still, almost too still, like it was holding its breath. I turned to head back to my room when I heard it. A faint sound like muffled voices, coming from downstairs. My heart pounded as I crept down the staircase, careful not to make a sound. The voices grew clearer with each step, low and urgent, coming from the kitchen. I stopped at the bottom of the stairs, staying hidden in the shadows as I strained to hear. "This is getting out of hand," Ethan said, his tone sharp. "We can't keep doing this." Laura's voice was calm, almost soothing. "You're overthinking it," she said. "Everything is under control." My stomach churned at her words. What was under control? And why did Ethan sound so desperate? I stepped closer, peeking around the corner to get a better look. Laura was leaning against the counter, her green eyes focused intently on Ethan. She wore a silk robe loosely tied, her blonde hair cascading over her shoulders. Ethan stood across from her, his posture tense, his hands clenched into fists. He looked like he wanted to run but couldn't bring himself to move. "I'm serious, Laura," Ethan said, his voice rising slightly. "This has to stop. It's not fair to him, and it's not fair to me." My breath caught in my throat. Was he talking about Liam? And what wasn't fair? I leaned closer, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure they could hear it. But before Ethan could say more, Laura reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "Ethan," she said softly, "you know this is for the best. We have to protect what we have." Protect what? My mind raced as I tried to piece together the conversation. It was clear they were hiding something that involved Liam. But the way Laura spoke to Ethan, the way she touched him, it wasn't maternal. It was something else entirely, something that made my skin crawl. I must have shifted because the next thing I knew, Laura's eyes snapped to the doorway. For a moment we locked eyes and my blood ran cold. Her expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in her gaze. Recognition, maybe even fear. "Is someone there?" she asked, her voice steady but sharp. I ducked back into the shadows, my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I bolted upstairs, my mind spinning. Back in my room, I tried to catch my breath, but the walls felt like they were closing in. Laura had seen me. I was sure of it. And Ethan. The look on his face, the way he had argued with her. It was clear he was trapped in whatever web Laura had spun. And Liam. He was part of it too, though I still didn't understand how. I felt like I was drowning in questions, each one more suffocating than the last. I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. Whatever was happening, it was tearing my family apart, and the longer I waited, the worse it would get. But who could I talk to? My dad was oblivious, completely enamored with Laura. And Ethan and Liam were both so deeply entangled in her lies that I wasn't sure I could trust them. I felt utterly alone, the weight of the truth pressing down on me like a boulder I couldn't move. But even as the fear consumed me, I knew one thing for sure. Laura's perfect facade was beginning to crack. And whatever secrets she was hiding, they were about to come spilling out. The only question was whether I was ready to face them. The morning after that tense encounter, the house was quieter than ever. Ethan didn't come downstairs for breakfast, and neither did Liam. My dad had already left for work, leaving Laura and me alone in the kitchen. She moved around gracefully, humming softly to herself as if nothing had happened. But I could feel her watching me, her green eyes flicking to mine every so often, measuring, calculating. She knew I had seen something, and she was waiting for me to make my move. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I grabbed my coffee and retreated to my room, my mind racing. I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan's words from the night before. It's not fair to him, and it's not fair to me. What wasn't fair? And why did he look so trapped? I needed answers, and I knew the only way to get them was to confront Ethan directly. But how? He had been avoiding me ever since I started asking questions, retreating further into his shell with each passing day. Later that afternoon, I decided to try anyway. I knocked on his door, my heart pounding in my chest. At first, there was no response, but then I heard his voice, muffled and weary. "Come in." I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, the curtains drawn tight against the afternoon sun. Ethan was sitting on the edge of his bed, his head in his hands. He looked up as I entered, his blue eyes bloodshot and filled with exhaustion. "What do you want, Linda?" he asked, his voice heavy with frustration. I hesitated, searching his face for any sign of the brother I used to know. I just want to talk," I said finally. He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "There's nothing to talk about." But I could see the tension in his posture, the way his hands trembled as he ran them through his messy hair. He was lying, and we both knew it. I stepped closer, my voice firm but gentle. "Ethan, I know something's going on. And I think it has to do with Laura." His reaction was immediate. He stood abruptly, pacing the room like a caged animal. "You don't know what you're talking about," he snapped. But his words lacked conviction, and his hands were shaking. I crossed my arms, refusing to back down. "Then tell me I'm wrong," I challenged. "Look me in the eye and tell me there's nothing going on." He stopped pacing, his shoulders slumping as he turned to face me. For a moment, he just stared at me, his blue eyes filled with a mix of anger and despair. "You wouldn't understand," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I stepped closer, my tone softer now. "Then help me understand," I said. "Because whatever this is, it's tearing you apart." Ethan hesitated, his gaze flicking to the door as if he expected Laura to walk in at any moment. "It's not that simple," he said. "None of this is." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my own emotions in check. "Ethan, I'm your sister. I just want to help. Please." For a moment I thought he was going to tell me everything. But then he shook his head, his jaw tightening. "I can't," he said. "I'm sorry." I wanted to scream, to shake him and demand the truth. But the look on his face stopped me. He looked broken, defeated, like he was carrying a weight he couldn't bear. I left his room that day feeling more lost than ever. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than I'd imagined, and Ethan was trapped in the middle of it. The question was, How deep did it go? That evening I decided to look for more clues. If Ethan wouldn't tell me the truth, I'd have to find it myself. I started in the living room, searching through the drawers and shelves for anything that might give me a hint. At first I found nothing, just old photo albums, magazines, and the usual clutter. But then I came across Laura's planner, tucked beneath a stack of papers. I opened it, my heart racing as I flipped through the pages. Most of it was normal, appointments, grocery lists, and reminders. But then, near the back, I found a series of notes written in Laura's elegant handwriting. They were short, cryptic messages that didn't seem to make sense. E after 10. L dinner Thursday. Keep quiet. My stomach churned as I read them, my mind racing to piece it together. A had to be Ethan, and L was likely Liam. But what did the rest mean? And what was she keeping quiet about? I closed the planner and shoved it back into the drawer, my hands trembling. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into an abyss I couldn't escape. The truth was right there, just out of reach, and every step I took brought me closer to a revelation I wasn't sure I was ready to face. But I couldn't stop now. I had to keep going, no matter the cost. As I stood there in the quiet of the living room, I made a decision. Whatever Laura was hiding, whatever web she had spun around Ethan and Liam, I was going to uncover it. And when I did, there would be no going back. Finding Laura's planner was like opening Pandora's box. It was small, bound in black leather, unassuming in every way. But inside it held secrets. Secrets that didn't just hint at betrayal, but screamed it. The cryptic notes scribbled on its pages were enough to confirm what I'd been suspecting all along. Laura wasn't just hiding something. She was orchestrating it. I sat on the living room floor, the planner open in front of me, my fingers trembling as I flipped through the pages. Each note was short, almost coded, but their implications were impossible to ignore. E after 10. L dinner Thursday, avoid R. Who was R? Was it my dad? My chest tightened as I thought about how blind he'd been to all of this. Laura had wrapped herself around our family, pulling strings behind the scenes while we played along, completely unaware. I tried to piece it all together to make sense of the fragments of information in front of me. The notes about Ethan were frequent, almost routine. E after 10 appeared at least 3 times in the past 2 weeks. The ones about Liam were less frequent but no less troubling. Elb checkin' home early. The more I read, the more it felt like Laura wasn't just involved with my brothers. She was controlling them. The weight of what I was uncovering threatened to crush me. I wanted to scream, to cry, to throw the planner across the room. But instead I took a deep breath and closed it, sliding it back into the drawer where I'd found it. I couldn't let Laura know I'd seen it. Not yet. If she knew I was onto her, she'd find a way to twist the narrative, to turn my family against me. Had to be smart. I had to gather more evidence. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions. How long had this been going on? Did my dad have any idea? And what about Ethan and Liam? Were they willing participants in whatever this was? Or had Laura manipulated them into it? The answers felt just out of reach, taunting me, and I hated how powerless I felt. I had to do something, but what? The next morning I decided to keep an eye on Laura. If her planner held this many secrets, there had to be more. I watched her closely as she moved around the house, her every gesture and glance scrutinized. At breakfast, she was her usual self, smiling, laughing, making small talk as if nothing was wrong. But I noticed the way her green eyes flicked to Ethan when she thought no one was looking. The way her hand brushed against his arm when she passed by. And then there was Liam, sitting silently at the table, his eyes fixed on his plate. He looked like he wanted to disappear. At one point, Laura excused herself to make a phone call. I waited a few minutes before quietly following her. She was in the study, the door slightly ajar, her voice low and calm. "It's under control," she was saying. "I'll handle it." I couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but her tone sent a chill down my spine. What was she handling? And who was she talking to? I moved closer, careful not to make a sound, but just as I leaned in, the floorboard creaked beneath my foot. Laura's voice stopped abruptly. My heart raced as I stepped back, trying to make it look like I wasn't eavesdropping. A moment later the door opened, and there she was, her green eyes sharp as they met mine. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice smooth but laced with suspicion. I forced a smile, trying to hide my nerves. "I was just looking for a notebook," I lied. She raised an eyebrow, clearly not convinced, but she didn't press the issue. "Well, the study isn't your personal library," she said, her tone light but pointed. "If you need something, just ask." With that, she brushed past me, leaving me standing there, my heart pounding in my chest. She knew. I could see it in her eyes. She knew I was watching her, and she wasn't going to let me get too close. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a mistake. Laura was too smart, too calculated. If she thought I was a threat, she'd find a way to neutralize me. I had to be careful, but I also couldn't let her intimidate me. I had to keep pushing to find the truth, no matter the cost. As I lay in bed, replaying the day's events in my mind, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I picked it up, expecting a message from a friend or a work notification. But what I saw made my blood run cold. It was a text from an unknown number. "Stop digging. You won't like what you find." My hands trembled as I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Who had sent it? Was it Laura? Or someone else? And how did they know what I was doing? I didn't sleep that night. The text was a warning, but it only made me more determined. Whatever Laura was hiding, whatever secrets she had buried, I was going to uncover them. And when I did, there would be no turning back. The text on my phone haunted me. "Stop digging. You won't like what you find." It was a warning, clear and simple, but it only made me more determined. Someone didn't want me to uncover the truth, and that meant I was closer than I realized. But closer to what? That was the question I couldn't answer, the thought that kept me up all night, staring at my ceiling as my mind raced. The next morning, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. Every sound, every movement felt amplified, like the house itself was alive and watching me. Laura was her usual self at breakfast, moving through the kitchen with her practiced grace, but I noticed the subtle tension in her movements. She was too cheerful, her smile a little too wide, her laughter a little too forced. And then there was Ethan. He barely spoke, his blue eyes downcast as he pushed his food around on his plate. Liam was nowhere to be found. I decided to look for Liam after breakfast. He'd been withdrawing more and more lately, retreating to his room or disappearing altogether. I knocked on his door, but there was no answer. I hesitated, then opened it slowly. The room was empty. His bed was unmade, and his laptop was sitting open on his desk. I walked over to it, my heart pounding, and saw an open email draft on the screen. The subject line read, "I can't do this anymore." My stomach dropped as I read the first line. I don't know how much longer I can keep this secret. It's eating me alive. The email wasn't addressed to anyone, and it wasn't finished, but the words were enough to confirm my worst fears. Liam was on the edge, and whatever he was hiding, it was tearing him apart. I closed the laptop, my hands trembling, and left the room, my mind racing with questions. Who was the email meant for? And what was the secret he couldn't bear to keep? I found Liam in the backyard later that afternoon. He was sitting on the edge of the deck, staring out at the garden with a faraway look in his eyes. His posture was slumped, his shoulders hunched like he was carrying the weight of the world. I approached slowly, not wanting to startle him. "Liam," I said softly, "can we talk?" He didn't look at me, didn't move, but after a long pause he nodded. I sat down beside him, the silence stretching between us like a chasm. "I saw your email," I said finally. His head snapped up, his light brown eyes wide with panic. "You went through my stuff?" he asked, his voice trembling. I shook my head. "No, I didn't mean to. Your laptop was open and... Liam, I'm worried about you." He looked away, his jaw tightening. You shouldn't have seen that, he said. You don't understand. Then help me understand, I pressed, my voice steady. Whatever's going on, you don't have to go through it alone. He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. You don't get it, Linda. If I tell you, if anyone finds out, he trailed off, his voice breaking. I reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. Liam, I'm your sister. Nothing you say will change that. Please just talk to me. For a moment, I thought he was going to open up. He turned to me, his eyes filled with tears, his lips parting as if to speak. But then he shook his head, standing abruptly. I can't, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. And just like that, he walked away, leaving me sitting there, my chest aching with the weight of everything unsaid. I knew I couldn't keep waiting for answers. Liam was spiraling, Ethan was unraveling, and Laura was at the center of it all, pulling the strings. I had to do something, but I didn't know what. That night, as I sat in my room, staring at the cryptic text on my phone, I decided to take a different approach. If Liam and Ethan wouldn't talk to me, maybe I could find out more by watching Laura. The next day I followed her. She left the house in the late afternoon, dressed impeccably in a tailored coat and heels, her blonde hair perfectly styled. She didn't say where she was going, but I waited a few minutes before grabbing my jacket and heading out. I kept a safe distance as I trailed her down the street, my heart pounding with every step. She stopped at a cafe, a cozy little place with floor-to-ceiling windows. I slipped inside, taking a seat near the back where I could see her but she couldn't see me. She sat at a small table by the window, her green eyes scanning the room as if she were waiting for someone. And then a man approached. He was tall and well-dressed, his dark hair slicked back. Laura smiled as he sat down across from her, her demeanor changing instantly. She leaned forward, her expression warm and engaged, her hand brushing against his as she reached for her coffee. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I didn't need to. The way she looked at him, the way she smiled, it was the same way she looked at Ethan. My stomach churned as I watched them, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Laura wasn't just manipulating my brothers. She was playing everyone, weaving a web of lies that stretched far beyond our family. As I sat there watching her, I realized something chilling. This wasn't just about my family. Laura had secrets that went deeper than I'd ever imagined, and I was only beginning to uncover the truth. But the more I learned, the more dangerous it became. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched too. Sitting in that cafe, watching Laura smile and lean toward the man across from her, I felt like I was seeing a stranger. The woman who had once seemed so loving and genuine now felt like a master manipulator, a puppeteer pulling strings I didn't even know existed. But who was this man? And how did he fit into the web Laura had spun around our family? I stayed in my seat, trying to blend in, my eyes fixed on them as they talked. Their conversation seemed animated. Laura laughed, her green eyes sparkling, while the man leaned closer, his expression intense. He reached across the table at one point, his hand briefly touching hers, and she didn't pull away. If I hadn't known better, I would have thought they were a couple. But something about the way they interacted felt calculated, like there was more beneath the surface. After about 30 minutes, the man stood, adjusting his coat as he prepared to leave. Laura smiled up at him, her demeanor warm but composed, and he leaned down to whisper something in her ear. I couldn't hear the words, but the look on her face, a flicker of tension quickly masked by a smile, told me it wasn't anything simple. He left the cafe without looking back, and Laura stayed seated for a moment, her expression unreadable. I waited until she stood and left before I followed, keeping a safe distance. She didn't head straight home. Instead, she walked to a nearby park, sitting on a bench beneath a cluster of trees. She pulled out her phone and began typing furiously, her posture tense. I wanted to get closer to see what she was doing, but I knew it was too risky. Instead, I watched from afar, trying to piece together what I'd just witnessed. Who was that man? Was he another one of Laura's projects, like Ethan and Liam? Or was he something more, a partner, an accomplice in whatever game she was playing. The questions swirled in my mind, each one more unsettling than the last. And then, as I stood there lost in thought, I felt it, a prickle at the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. I turned quickly, scanning the park, but there was no one there. Just a few joggers and a couple walking their dog, none of whom seemed to be paying me any attention. I shook my head, telling myself I was being paranoid. But the feeling didn't go away. Even as I walked back home, I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being followed. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the man in the cafe. His dark hair, his sharp suit, the way Laura had leaned toward him like they shared a secret. I tried searching for answers online, typing vague descriptions into search engines, but it was useless. There were too many possibilities, too many dead ends. And then I remembered something. Laura's planner. If she'd been meeting this man regularly, maybe there was something about him in her notes. I waited until the house was quiet, then crept downstairs to the living room. The planner was still in the drawer where I'd left it, hidden beneath a stack of magazines. I opened it carefully, flipping through the pages, my heart racing as I searched for anything that might give me a clue. And then I found it. A single entry, written in Laura's elegant handwriting. M. Dinner 7 p.m. M. Who was M? My mind raced as I tried to connect the dots. Was he the man from the cafe? And if so, what was their connection? The entry didn't provide any answers, only more questions. I closed the planner and put it back in the drawer, my hands trembling. Whatever Laura was involved in, it was bigger than I'd thought. And it wasn't just my family at stake. The next morning, I decided to confront Ethan again. If anyone knew more about Laura's secrets, it was him. I knocked on his door, and after a long pause, he opened it, his expression guarded. "What do you want, Linda?" he asked, his voice flat. I didn't mince words. "Who's M?" asked. His eyes widened slightly, but he quickly masked his reaction. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, stepping back as if to close the door. But I wasn't letting him off that easily. I stepped inside, forcing him to face me. "Ethan, I saw her with him," I said. "The cafe. She's hiding something and you know what it is. Just tell me the truth." He looked away, his jaw tightening. "I can't," he said finally. "It's not my place." His words only fueled my frustration. "Then whose place is it?" I demanded. "Because whatever this is, it's tearing our family apart." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his messy hair. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low. "It's not just about us. It's complicated." I crossed my arms, refusing to back down. "Then uncomplicate it," I said. "Because if you don't, I will." He looked at me then, his blue eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. Fear, guilt, maybe both. "Just be careful, Linda," he said finally. "You're playing with fire." His words sent a chill through me. I wanted to push him further, to make him tell me everything, but I knew I wouldn't get anywhere. Not yet. As I left his room, his warning echoed in my mind. "You're playing with fire." He was right. I could feel the flames already, and I had no idea how far they would spread. But even as the fear gripped me, I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stop now. The truth was closer than ever, and I was willing to risk everything to uncover it. The only question was whether I'd survive the fallout. Ethan's words stayed with me long after I left his room. "You're playing with fire." It wasn't just a warning. It was a plea, a desperate attempt to keep me from digging any deeper. But the truth was I couldn't stop. Not now. The web Laura had spun around our family was unraveling, and I was determined to follow the threads, no matter where they led. That evening I decided to try again. I waited until the house was quiet, until Laura was in her room and Liam had retreated to his own space. Then I knocked on Ethan's door. This time he didn't make me wait. He opened it almost immediately, his blue eyes tired and wary. "What now?" he asked, his voice low. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. "Ethan," I said, my tone firm but gentle, I need you to be honest with me. He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head as he leaned against the wall. You don't know what you're asking for, he said. I crossed my arms, refusing to back down. Maybe not, I admitted. But I can't keep living like this. I can't keep pretending everything is fine when it's not. He looked at me then, his blue eyes filled with a mix of anger and despair. Fine, he said finally. You want the truth. Here it is. Ethan paced the room as he spoke, his voice low but filled with emotion. It started a year ago, he began, running a hand through his messy hair. Laura. She has this way of making you feel like you're the only person in the world. She made me feel seen, understood, like I mattered. And at first I thought it was innocent. I thought she just cared about me, you know? Like a mom. He paused, his jaw tightening. But it wasn't like that. It was never like that. My chest tightened as I listened, the weight of his words sinking in. She crossed a line, he continued, his voice trembling. I don't even know when it happened, but one day it just wasn't normal anymore. And I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't want to stop it. He looked at me then, his expression filled with guilt. I know how it sounds, Linda. I know how messed up it is. But she's not who you think she is. I sat down on the edge of his bed, trying to process what he was telling me. Ethan, I said carefully, are you saying you and Laura? He didn't let me finish. He nodded, his jaw clenching as he looked away. Yeah, he said. It's been going on for a while. And it's not just me. My stomach dropped at his words. What do you mean it's not just you? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, his hands clenching into fists. It's Liam too, he said finally. She's been playing both of us. The room seemed to spin around me as I tried to comprehend what he was saying. Laura wasn't just manipulating Ethan. She was manipulating Liam too. My brothers were caught in her web, tangled in a relationship that shouldn't exist. And they both knew it. Does Dad know? I asked, my voice shaking. Ethan shook his head. No, he said. And he can't. He'd never believe it. She's got him wrapped around her finger. I stood then, pacing the room as my mind raced. Ethan, this is insane, I said. We have to do something. We can't just let her keep doing this. He sighed, sitting down on the bed with his head in his hands. You think I don't know that, he said, his voice muffled. You think I don't feel like crap every single day. But what am I supposed to do? She's got all the power, Linda. If I say anything, she'll ruin me. And Liam. His words sent a chill through me. Laura wasn't just a manipulator. She was a predator. And she'd managed to control both Ethan and Liam so completely that they felt trapped, unable to fight back. But I wasn't going to let her win. Couldn't. Ethan, I said, my voice firm. We're going to figure this out. Together. She doesn't get to keep doing this. Not to you. Not to Liam. Not to any of us. For a moment, he just looked at me. His blue eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. You don't know what you're getting into, he said. She's dangerous, Linda. She's not who you think she is. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. Maybe not, I said. But I'm not afraid of her. And you shouldn't be either. As I left his room that night, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Anger, sadness, determination. The truth was finally coming to light, but it was darker and more twisted than I'd ever imagined. Laura had taken everything good about our family and turned it into something toxic, something poisonous. And it was up to me to stop her. But even as I made that promise to myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into a trap. Laura had already proven how far she was willing to go to protect her secrets. And I had a sinking feeling that the worst was yet to come. Ethan's confession left me reeling. The truth was out, but it was darker and more twisted than I could have imagined. Laura had manipulated my brothers, turned our family into her personal playground, and made herself untouchable in the process. I wanted to scream, to cry, to tell my dad everything. But I knew I couldn't. Not yet. Ethan had made it clear. Laura was dangerous, and exposing her wouldn't be easy. But there was one person who could help me fill in the missing pieces. Liam. I waited until the next morning to approach him. He was in the backyard, sitting on the edge of the deck, his shoulders hunched and his head down. He looked so small, so lost, that my heart ached just looking at him. I walked over slowly, my footsteps quiet on the wooden planks. Liam, I said softly, can we talk? He didn't respond, didn't even look up. But after a long pause, he nodded. I sat down beside him, the silence stretching between us. For a moment, I didn't know how to start. How do you ask your brother if he's been caught in the same web of lies and manipulation as the other? Finally, I took a deep breath and said, Ethan told me. His head snapped up, his light brown eyes wide with panic. He told you what? He asked, his voice shaking. I met his gaze, my own steady but soft. About Laura. About everything. Liam froze, his hands clenching into fists as he looked away. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, his voice flat. But I could see the fear in his posture, the way his shoulders tensed and his breathing quickened. Liam, I said gently, you don't have to lie. I know she's been involved with you. I know she's been playing both of you. He flinched at my words, his jaw tightening as he stared at the ground. You don't understand, he said finally. It's not like that. I reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. Then help me understand, I said. Because whatever this is, it's not okay. And it's not your fault. He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. You think that makes it better? He asked. You think that changes anything? I didn't know how to respond, so I stayed quiet, giving him the space to speak. After a long silence, Liam began to talk. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but the words cut through me like a knife. She makes you feel like you're the only person in the world, he said. Like you're special, like you matter. And then she uses it against you. She twists everything until you don't even know who you are anymore. He looked up at me then, his eyes filled with tears. I hate her, Linda. I hate what she's done to us. But I don't know how to stop it. My chest tightened as I listened, the weight of his words sinking in. Laura hadn't just manipulated my brothers, she'd broken them. She'd taken their vulnerabilities, their need for love and validation, and turned it into a weapon. And now they were both trapped, unable to see a way out. Liam, I said softly, you don't have to do this alone. We can figure this out. Together. But Liam shook his head, his expression filled with despair. You don't get it, he said. She's not just messing with us. She's messing with everything. Dad, the house, our lives. She's got control over all of it. If we try to fight her, she'll destroy us. His words sent a chill through me. Laura wasn't just a manipulator. She was a master at it, and she'd built her power on the backs of my family. I wanted to argue, to tell him that we could stand up to her, but the look in his eyes stopped me. He was terrified, and it wasn't just about Laura. There was something else, something he wasn't saying. Liam, I said carefully, what aren't you telling me? He hesitated, his gaze darting to the house as if he expected Laura to appear at any moment. She's not working alone, he said finally, his voice barely audible. There's someone else. Someone bigger. My stomach dropped at his words. Someone else. Was it the man from the cafe? The one Laura had met so casually, yet so intimately. My mind raced as I tried to piece it together. Who? I asked, my voice steady despite the fear building inside me. Liam shook his head. I don't know, he said. She doesn't talk about him much. But I've heard her on the phone late at night. She's scared of him, Linda. Scared in a way I've never seen before. His words left me shaken. If Laura, the woman who had manipulated and controlled my family with such ease, was afraid of someone, then whoever it was must be powerful, dangerous. And suddenly I realized just how deep this went. This wasn't just about my family anymore. This was about something bigger, something darker. And I was right in the middle of it. Before I could ask more, Liam stood abruptly, his hands shaking as he shoved them into his pockets. "I can't do this," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry, Linda. I can't." He walked away before I could stop him, leaving me alone on the deck, the weight of his words pressing down on me like a physical force. I wanted to follow him, to make him stay and tell me everything, but I knew it wouldn't help. He was too scared, too broken. And I couldn't blame him. But as I sat there staring at the garden, I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stop now. The truth was bigger than I'd ever imagined, and the only way to save my family was to uncover it, no matter what it cost me. The morning after Liam's confession, the atmosphere in the house was heavier than ever. Ethan and Liam were both avoiding me, and Laura was her usual charming self, pretending nothing was wrong. But I knew better. The truth was out there, tangled in a web of lies, and I was determined to untangle it, no matter what it took. I just didn't realize how much closer it was to unraveling. It was mid-morning when the doorbell rang. I was in the kitchen, staring blankly at my coffee, when the sound jolted me back to reality. Laura, who had been scrolling through her phone at the dining table, stood gracefully and made her way to the door. Her calm demeanor didn't waver, but there was a sharpness in her movements that made my stomach twist. I followed her to the foyer, staying just out of sight as she opened the door. A man stood there, tall and imposing, his dark eyes scanning the house behind her before settling on Laura. My breath caught in my throat. It was the man from the cafe. He wore a sleek black suit, his expression unreadable as he greeted Laura with a curt nod. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but commanding. Laura stepped aside to let him in, her green eyes flicking briefly toward me before she led him into the living room. I stayed hidden, my heart pounding as I pressed myself against the wall. Who was this man? And what did he want from Laura? I couldn't hear much of their conversation, just snippets of words spoken in hushed tones. Timeline, complications, and control. Each word sent a shiver down my spine, the pieces of the puzzle growing more ominous. I couldn't stay hidden forever. I needed to know what was going on. Steeling myself, I crept closer, peeking around the corner to get a better look. Laura sat on the couch, her posture relaxed but her expression tense. The man stood across from her, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze piercing. "You're losing your grip," he said sharply. This wasn't part of the plan. Laura's jaw tightened, her green eyes narrowing. "I've got everything under control," she replied, her voice steady but cold. Their exchange sent a flurry of questions racing through my mind. A plan. What grip was Laura losing? And why did this man seem so involved in our lives? I stayed rooted to my spot, afraid to move but desperate for answers. And then, as if sensing my presence, the man's gaze shifted. His dark eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment the world seemed to stop. Laura followed his gaze, her expression hardening as she saw me. "Linda," she said, her voice sharp but composed, "is there something you need?" I stepped into the room, my heart pounding but my head held high. "Who is he?" I asked, ignoring the tension in the air. The man's lips curved into a faint smile, but there was no warmth in it. "I'm an old friend of Laura's," he said smoothly, his voice dripping with false charm. I didn't buy it. There was something about him, something cold and calculated, that set off every alarm in my head. "An old friend," I repeated, my tone skeptical. Laura's smile didn't falter, but I could see the cracks forming. "Yes," she said, standing and placing a hand on his arm. "Michael and I go way back. He's just here to catch up." I glanced between them, my hazel eyes narrowing. "Does Dad know about your old friend?" I asked pointedly. Laura's composure slipped for just a moment, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. "Your father has nothing to do with this," she said, her tone sharp. But Michael, or whoever he was, stepped in smoothly. "I think it's best if we continue this conversation another time," he said, his dark eyes boring into mine. "It was a pleasure meeting you, Linda." His words felt more like a warning than a pleasantry, and I couldn't shake the chill they left behind. As he left, Laura turned to me, her green eyes cold and calculating. "You need to stop this," she said quietly, her voice low and threatening. "You're playing with things you don't understand." But instead of fear, her words filled me with resolve. "Maybe it's you who doesn't understand," I shot back. "This is my family too, and I'm not going to let you destroy it." Laura didn't respond. She just stared at me for a moment, her expression unreadable, before turning and walking away. I stood there, my heart racing, my mind spinning. Michael's visit had confirmed what I already knew. Laura wasn't working alone. There was a bigger game at play, and I was determined to figure it out. But the more I uncovered, the more dangerous it became. As the door closed behind Michael, I realized something chilling. This wasn't just about Laura or my brothers anymore. This was about power, control, and secrets that went far beyond our family. And I was running out of time to uncover them. After Michael's departure, the house felt suffocating. Laura had retreated to her room, leaving behind an eerie silence that only deepened my unease. His visit had confirmed my worst suspicions. Laura wasn't acting alone. There was a larger, more sinister force at play, and I was determined to uncover it. But the closer I got to the truth, the more dangerous it felt. I found Ethan in the garage that afternoon, tinkering with his old motorcycle. His shoulders were tense, his movements jerky, as if he was trying to work through something he couldn't say out loud. "Ethan," I called softly, stepping into the dimly lit space. He didn't look up, but I could see the way his jaw clenched, the way his hands tightened around the wrench. "Not now, Linda," he muttered, his voice strained. But I wasn't going to let him push me away. "We need to talk," I said, my tone firmer. He sighed heavily, setting the wrench down with a clatter before turning to face me. His blue eyes were filled with a mix of exhaustion and frustration. "What now?" he asked. I crossed my arms, meeting his gaze head-on. "Who is Michael?" I demanded. The question caught him off guard, his eyes widening briefly before narrowing. "Where did you hear that name?" he asked, his voice low. I hesitated for a moment, debating whether to reveal that I'd seen Michael in our house. But then I decided against it. If Ethan didn't know about Michael's visit, it was better to keep it that way for now. "I overheard Laura on the phone," I lied. "She mentioned him." "Who is he, Ethan?" He looked away, running a hand through his messy hair. "You shouldn't be asking questions about him," he said finally. "It's not safe." His words sent a chill down my spine. "Not safe," I repeated. "Ethan, what's going on? Who is he? And what does he have to do with Laura?" Ethan let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You don't get it, Linda," he said. "This isn't just about Laura. It's bigger than that. Bigger than all of us." His words left me reeling. What could be bigger than the destruction Laura had already caused? And why was Michael so central to it? Before I could press further, Ethan grabbed his tools and turned back to the motorcycle. "Just drop it, Linda," he said, his tone final. But I couldn't. I couldn't ignore the warning in his voice, the fear in his eyes. Something about Michael had shaken Ethan, and that terrified me more than anything else. I left the garage feeling more determined than ever. If Ethan wasn't going to give me answers, I'd have to find them myself. I decided to check Laura's room while she was out. I knew it was risky, but I had no other choice. If Michael was as dangerous as Ethan seemed to think, I needed to know what role he played in Laura's schemes. Laura's room was immaculate, as always. The soft scent of lavender filled the air, and everything was perfectly in place. But I knew better than to trust appearances. I started with her nightstand, carefully opening the drawer and sifting through its contents. It was mostly unremarkable: books, a notepad, a few pens. But then at the bottom I found an envelope. My heart raced as I opened it, revealing a series of documents. Bank statements, to be exact. And they weren't just Laura's. My dad's name was on several of them, along with large transfers to an account I didn't recognize. The amounts were staggering, enough to make my stomach churn. What was Laura doing with this money? And why was it being funneled into an account tied to Michael? The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the picture they painted was more terrifying than I'd imagined. I was so focused on the documents that I didn't hear the footsteps until it was too late. "What do you think you're doing?" Laura's voice cut through the air like a knife, sharp and cold. I froze, the envelope still in my hands, as she stepped into the room. Her green eyes burned with fury, her usually composed demeanor cracking under the weight of her anger. "Put that down," she said, her voice low and dangerous. I met her gaze, my heart pounding but my resolve unwavering. "What is this, Laura?" I asked, holding up the documents. "What are you doing with Dad's money? And who is Michael?" She took a step closer, her expression darkening. "You don't know what you're talking about," she said. "You're playing a dangerous game, Linda. Stop before you get hurt." Her words sent a chill through me, but I refused to back down. "No," I said firmly. "I'm not stopping. Not until I know the truth." Laura's lips curved into a cold smile, but there was no humor in it. "You're just like your father," she said. "So determined, so righteous. But you don't understand, Linda. You never have." Before I could respond, Laura snatched the envelope from my hands, her movements quick and precise. "You've gone too far," she said, her voice dripping with menace. "But if you're so eager to destroy this family, go ahead. Just remember you asked for this." Her words hung in the air as she turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, my chest tight with fear and anger. As I stood in the middle of her room, the envelope now gone, I realized something chilling. Laura wasn't just playing games, she was fighting a war. And I was the enemy. But if she thought I was going to back down, she was wrong. The truth was closer than ever, and I wasn't going to stop until I uncovered every last secret. Laura's cold smile and chilling words echoed in my mind long after she left the room. "You've gone too far. Just remember you asked for this." Her threat was as clear as it was terrifying, but it only fueled my resolve. She had made one thing abundantly clear. She was hiding something monumental, and I was closer to uncovering it than ever before. The question was, what would it cost me? The next morning, I decided to dig deeper into the mysterious man, Michael. He wasn't just some old friend of Laura's. That much was obvious. He was tied to her schemes in ways I couldn't yet understand, but I was determined to figure it out. I started with the bank statements I'd seen the day before, memorizing the account number before Laura snatched them away. If I could trace the transactions, maybe I could uncover who Michael really was. I waited until the house was quiet, then grabbed my laptop and began my search. At first, it felt impossible. There were countless financial institutions and millions of accounts. But then I remembered something Ethan had said. "It's bigger than all of us." The idea sent a shiver down my spine, but it also gave me a clue. Whatever this was, it wasn't small. Had to leave a trail. I typed the account number into a search engine, hoping for anything that could point me in the right direction. And then I found it. The account was tied to a company called Gulfstream Holdings. The name didn't mean much to me at first, but as I dug deeper, I realized it was no ordinary business. Gulfstream Holdings was a shadowy conglomerate, involved in everything from offshore banking to high-stakes real estate. Its board of directors was a who's who of powerful figures, and one name stood out: Michael Carrington. My breath caught as I stared at the screen, the pieces clicking into place. Michael wasn't just some ally of Laura's. He was a key player in a much larger game. And Gulfstream Holdings wasn't just a company. It was a front for something far more sinister. The money Laura had funneled into that account wasn't just disappearing, it was funding something. But what? I was so engrossed in my research that I didn't hear the footsteps until it was too late. "What are you doing?" Ethan's voice made me jump, my heart racing as I slammed the laptop shut. He stood in the doorway, his blue eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Nothing," I said quickly, but the look on his face told me he didn't believe me. He stepped closer, his jaw tight. "Linda, if you're digging into Laura's business, you need to stop." I stood, crossing my arms as I met his gaze. Why? Yes. Because it's dangerous. Because Michael might come after me. Then don't you get it? This isn't just about Laura anymore. This is about all of us. Whatever she's involved in, it's tearing this family apart. His expression softened for a moment, the anger fading into something closer to fear. You don't know what you're getting into, he said quietly. Michael. He's not someone you mess with. His words sent a chill down my spine, but I refused to back down. I don't care how dangerous he is, I said. I'm not going to let Laura destroy us. And I'm not going to let her use you and Liam as pawns in whatever game she's playing. Ethan looked away, his hands clenching into fists. It's not that simple, he muttered. Nothing about this is simple. Before I could respond, Liam appeared in the doorway, his light brown eyes wide with panic. What's going on? He asked, his voice trembling. Ethan turned to him, his expression hardening. Nothing, he said quickly. But Liam's gaze shifted to me, his fear deepening. Linda, please, he said. Don't push this. You don't understand what you're up against. The tension in the room was suffocating. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but I could see how scared they both were. Whatever Laura and Michael were involved in, it had them both trapped. And I was starting to realize just how dangerous it was to dig any deeper. But I couldn't stop now. Not when I was so close to the truth. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions. What was Gulfstream Holdings? What was Laura's role in it? And why was Michael so invested in keeping it a secret? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just about my family anymore. This was about power, corruption, and secrets that went far beyond our home. As the clock ticked past midnight, I made a decision. If Ethan and Liam wouldn't help me, I'd have to do it alone. I opened my laptop again, typing Gulfstream Holdings into a deeper search engine. What I found made my blood run cold. The company wasn't just involved in shady business. It was tied to political scandals, offshore accounts, and even criminal enterprises. And Laura wasn't just a pawn in their game. She was a key player. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding as the truth began to take shape. Laura wasn't just manipulating our family. She was part of something far more dangerous. And as I sat there, piecing it all together, I realized one terrifying fact. If Laura was willing to go this far, there was nothing she wouldn't do to protect her secrets. The revelation about Gulfstream Holdings hit me like a freight train. It wasn't just a company. It was a labyrinth of deceit, power, and corruption. And Laura wasn't just entangled in it. She was an active player. As I stared at the web of connections on my laptop screen, one thing became clear. This wasn't just about our family anymore. This was about something much bigger, something that could destroy us all. The next morning, I woke with a renewed sense of determination. Laura might have been skilled at deception, but her arrogance would be her downfall. She'd made one crucial mistake. She underestimated me. I decided to confront her directly, to push her and see how much she'd reveal. If I was going to take her down, I needed to understand exactly what I was up against. I found her in the dining room, sipping coffee and flipping through a glossy magazine. She looked as calm and composed as ever, her green eyes scanning the pages as if she didn't have a care in the world. But I knew better. We need to talk, I said, my voice steady as I stepped into the room. Laura glanced up, her expression unreadable. About what? She asked, setting the magazine down. I took a deep breath. About Gulfstream Holdings. For the first time I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Surprise, maybe even fear. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by her usual cool demeanor. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, her tone dismissive. I crossed my arms, meeting her gaze. Don't play dumb, Laura, I said. I know about the bank transfers. I know about Michael. And I know about Gulfstream Holdings. She leaned back in her chair, her green eyes narrowing as she studied me. You've been busy, she said, her voice sharp. But you don't know what you're getting into. I stepped closer, refusing to back down. Then why don't you enlighten me? Challenged. What is Gulfstream Holdings? And why are you funneling Dad's money into it? Laura stood then, her movements slow and deliberate. You think you're so clever, don't you? She said, her tone dripping with condescension. But you have no idea how deep this goes. Gulfstream Holdings isn't just a company, Linda. It's a network. A power structure that controls more than you could ever imagine. Her words sent a chill down my spine, but I didn't let it show. And you're part of it. Yes. You're using our family to fund it. Her lips curved into a cold smile. I'm protecting this family, she said. Everything I've done has been for us. I shook my head, my hazel eyes blazing. Don't lie to me, Laura, I said. This isn't about protecting us. This is about power. This is about you. Her expression hardened, her green eyes flashing with anger. You think you know everything, she said. But you don't. And if you keep digging, you're going to get hurt. Her threat hung in the air, but instead of scaring me, it fueled my determination. You can't scare me, Laura, I said. I'm not going to stop until I expose you. She stepped closer, her green eyes locking onto mine. You don't understand what you're up against, she said, her voice low. This isn't just about me. There are people involved who would do anything to protect what we've built. People far more powerful than you or me. Her words sent a chill through me, but I refused to back down. Then let them come, I said. Because I'm not afraid of the truth. For a moment we just stared at each other, the tension crackling like electricity. And then, without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, my chest heaving with anger and fear. That night I decided to take another risk. If Laura wasn't going to give me answers, I'd find them myself. I waited until the house was quiet, then snuck into her office. It was a small room, lined with bookshelves and a large oak desk. I started with the drawers, carefully sifting through their contents. Most of it was mundane: bills, receipts, letters. But then I found a folder labeled "Confidential." Inside were documents that made my blood run cold. Contracts, emails, and financial statements, all tied to Gulfstream Holdings. One email in particular stood out. It was from Michael, and it was chilling in its simplicity. The transfer is complete. Ensure there are no loose ends. My hands trembled as I read it, the implications sinking in. Laura wasn't just involved with Gulfstream Holdings. She was actively working with them to cover their tracks. And I had no doubt what loose ends meant. As I stood there staring at the evidence, I heard a noise behind me, a soft creak like someone stepping into the room. I spun around, my heart pounding, but the room was empty. Still, the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. I quickly put the folder back and left the office, my mind racing. If Laura or Michael knew what I'd found, I was in more danger than ever. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized just how deep I was in. Laura's power wasn't just personal, it was systemic. And the closer I got to the truth, the more I risked. But even as fear gripped me, I knew I couldn't stop. The web was tightening, and if I didn't unravel it, it would consume us all. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched as I left Laura's office that night. The evidence I had uncovered was damning: emails, financial records, and contracts that tied Laura to Gulfstream Holdings and Michael. It was bigger than I had imagined, and it was clear they'd do anything to protect their secrets. I thought I was prepared for whatever came next, but I was wrong. The next morning, Laura was colder than ever. She barely acknowledged me at breakfast. Her green eyes focused on her phone as if I didn't exist. Ethan and Liam were unusually quiet, exchanging nervous glances but saying nothing. My dad, oblivious as always, tried to make small talk, but the tension in the room was unbearable. I felt like I was sitting on a ticking time bomb, and it was only a matter of time before it exploded. I decided to spend the day away from the house, needing space to think. I took my laptop to a quiet cafe, far enough from home that I felt like I could breathe. I started sifting through the documents I had taken photos of the night before, piecing together the connections between Laura, Gulfstream Holdings, and Michael. The deeper I dug, the more horrifying it became. This wasn't just about money or power, it was about control. And my family was at the center of it. One document in particular caught my eye. It was a contract signed by both Laura and Michael, with a clause that made my stomach churn. All assets, financial and otherwise, are subject to reallocation upon directive. The word assets was underlined, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it didn't just refer to money. My heart pounded as I thought about what that could mean for Ethan, Liam, and even my dad. Were they considered assets too? As I stared at the screen, lost in thought, my phone buzzed on the table. I picked it up, expecting a message from a friend or maybe Ethan. But it wasn't. It was from an unknown number, and the message was short and chilling. "You're in over your head. Walk away while you still can." My hands trembled as I read the words, the cafe suddenly feeling too small, too exposed. I glanced around, but no one seemed to be paying attention to me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I left the cafe, my heart racing as I walked quickly down the street. Every shadow felt like a threat, every passerby a potential enemy. By the time I reached my car, I was shaking. I locked the doors and sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath. The text was a warning, but it wasn't going to stop me. If anything, it only made me more determined. Whoever sent it was scared, and that meant I was onto something big. When I got home, the house was eerily quiet. Laura's car was gone, and my dad was in his office, likely oblivious to the storm brewing around him. I found Ethan and Liam in the living room, their expressions tense as they stared at the TV. They didn't even look up when I walked in. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside me. Ethan finally turned. His blue eyes filled with a mix of anger and exhaustion. "About what?" he asked. Held up my phone. "This." Liam's eyes widened as he read the message, his face paling. "Who sent that?" he asked, his voice trembling. I shook my head. "I don't know," I said. "But I think it's connected to Gulfstream Holdings." Ethan stood, his jaw tight as he ran a hand through his messy hair. "You need to stop, Linda," he said, his tone sharp. "You're going to get yourself killed." His words sent a chill down my spine, but I refused to back down. "If I don't stop, who will?" Shot back. "Laura is destroying this family, and you both know it." Liam stood then, his hands clenched into fists. "You don't understand," he said, his voice breaking. "This isn't just about Laura. It's about all of us. She's not the only one pulling the strings." His words hung in the air, heavy with implications I didn't yet understand. "What do you mean?" I asked, stepping closer. Liam hesitated, his light brown eyes darting to Ethan, who shook his head. "Don't," Ethan said quietly. But Liam ignored him. "Gulfstream Holdings doesn't just own her," he said. "They own all of us." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What are you talking about?" I demanded. Liam looked away, his jaw tightening. "She's not the only one with a contract," he said finally. "We all have them. Ethan, me, Dad, even you." My heart pounded as his words sank in. "That's impossible," I said, my voice shaking. "I never signed anything." Liam turned to me then, his expression grim. "You didn't have to," he said. "She signed for all of us." As the weight of his words settled over me, I realized just how deep Laura's control went. She hadn't just manipulated us, she'd sold us. And as I stared at my brothers, their fear written across their faces, one thought consumed me. If we didn't break free soon, there'd be nothing left of our family to save. Liam's words echoed in my mind long after he left the room. She signed for all of us. It was a revelation so horrifying, so incomprehensible, that it felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. Laura hadn't just manipulated us. She had legally bound us to Gulfstream Holdings, turning our lives into assets in a game we didn't even know we were playing. I had to figure out how she'd done it, and more importantly, how to undo it. I spent the rest of the evening in my room, poring over the photos of the documents I'd taken from Laura's office. Every line, every clause seemed designed to trap us further, each one more insidious than the last. But one document stood out, a contract marked with a signature I recognized. My father's. It wasn't just Laura who had signed away our lives. Dad had been part of it too. Whether he'd done it knowingly or been deceived, I couldn't say. But the betrayal stung just the same. The next morning, I decided to confront him. He was in his office, buried in paperwork as usual. His salt and pepper hair slightly disheveled. He looked up as I entered, his warm brown eyes filled with the usual affection, but there was something else there too. Exhaustion, maybe even guilt. "Linda," he said, setting his pen down. "What's on your mind?" I hesitated for a moment, the words catching in my throat. Then I took a deep breath and said, "Dad, did you know Laura signed contracts with Gulfstream Holdings? Contracts that include all of us." His expression froze, his eyes narrowing slightly as he leaned back in his chair. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his tone cautious. I placed the photo of the contract on his desk, watching as his gaze flicked to it. For a moment he said nothing, his face unreadable. Then he sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "It's not what you think," he said. "Laura told me it was an investment, something to secure our future." I didn't know, his voice trailed off, and I felt my anger rising. "You didn't know," I repeated. "Dad, you signed away our lives." He stood then, his posture defensive as he faced me. "I trusted her," he said, his voice firm. "She said she was protecting us, that this was the best way to ensure we'd be taken care of." I shook my head, my hazel eyes blazing. "And you didn't think to ask questions? To read the fine print?" He looked away, his jaw tightening. "I didn't think I needed to," he admitted quietly. "I thought she had our best interests at heart." His words stung, but they also confirmed what I already knew. Laura had manipulated him as easily as she had the rest of us. But this wasn't just about Dad's naivety. It was about undoing the damage she'd done. "We have to fight this," I said, my voice firm. "We have to find a way to break these contracts." Dad looked at me then, his expression filled with a mix of regret and resolve. "I don't know if we can," he said. "But I'll do whatever it takes to try." With Dad on my side, I felt a renewed sense of determination. But I knew we couldn't do it alone. We needed more information, more leverage. That meant going back to the one place I'd been avoiding, Laura's office. I waited until she left the house, then enlisted Ethan and Liam to help me. At first, they were reluctant, their fear of Laura's wrath holding them back. But when I showed them the contract with their names on it, their hesitation vanished. We worked quickly, sifting through drawers, files, and cabinets, searching for anything that could give us an edge. It was Liam who found it, a hidden compartment in the bottom drawer of the desk. Inside was a USB drive, its label blank but ominous. "What do you think is on it?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Only one way to find out," I said, plugging it into my laptop. What we found made my blood run cold. The drive was filled with files, emails, financial records, and contracts that went far beyond our family. There were names, dates, and transactions that painted a chilling picture of Gulfstream Holdings' reach. Politicians, CEOs, even law enforcement, they were all tied to the company, their loyalty bought with money, favors, or blackmail. And Laura wasn't just a pawn in their game. She was an active participant, her name appearing again and again in the documents. One email in particular caught my attention. It was from Michael, and it was addressed to Laura. The subject line read, "Containment Plan." The message was short but chilling. "If Linda keeps digging, make her stop. Permanently." My hands trembled as I read the words, my stomach twisting with fear. They knew I was a threat, and they were prepared to eliminate me if necessary. But even as the fear took hold, it fueled my determination. They wanted me to stop because they knew I was close to the truth. And I wasn't going to stop now. As we sat in Laura's office, the weight of the truth pressing down on us, I realized just how high the stakes had become. This wasn't just about our family anymore. It was about exposing a system of power and corruption that would destroy anyone who stood in its way. And if Laura and Michael thought they could silence me, they were about to find out just how wrong they were. The discovery of the USB drive felt like the moment the ground gave way beneath my feet. Michael's chilling email had made one thing abundantly clear. This wasn't just a game anymore. It was a battle for survival, and I was squarely in their crosshairs. But even as fear gripped me, I couldn't stop. The truth was too important, and if Laura and Michael thought they could silence me, they didn't know me at all. That night I called a meeting with Ethan, Liam, and Dad in the living room. The tension was palpable as we sat in a circle, the USB drive sitting ominously on the coffee table between us. "We're all in this now," I began, my voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside me. "Laura isn't just manipulating us. She's tied to something much bigger. Something dangerous." I glanced at each of them in turn, their faces reflecting varying degrees of fear, anger, and confusion. "What exactly are we dealing with?" Dad asked, his voice strained. I took a deep breath and began explaining everything: the contracts, the connections to Gulfstream Holdings, and the drive's contents. Their reactions ranged from disbelief to outright horror. "This can't be real," Liam whispered, his light brown eyes wide with panic. "It's real," I said firmly. "And if we don't do something about it, it's going to destroy us." Ethan leaned forward, his blue eyes narrowing as he rested his elbows on his knees. "So what's the plan?" he asked. "We can't just sit here and wait for them to come after us." His words sent a chill through me, but he was right. We needed a plan, and we needed it fast. "First, we need more information," I said. "There are files on this drive that could expose Gulfstream Holdings, but we need to understand them better." Dad nodded, his expression grim. "I can reach out to some contacts," he said. "People I trust. If we can get these documents analyzed, we might be able to figure out how to fight back." His words gave me a flicker of hope, but it was quickly overshadowed by the enormity of what we were facing. Gulfstream Holdings wasn't just powerful, it was untouchable. And we were just a family caught in its web. As we discussed our next steps, a sound outside made us all freeze. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable, the crunch of footsteps on the gravel driveway. My heart raced as I stood, motioning for everyone to stay quiet. I crept to the window, peeking through the curtains. A black car was parked just outside the house, its engine idling. Two men stood by the car, their faces obscured in the shadows. "Who are they?" Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. I shook my head, my stomach twisting with fear. "I don't know," I said. "But we need to be careful." The men didn't move, their presence a silent threat that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. After what felt like an eternity, they got back into the car and drove away, leaving behind an eerie silence that felt even more ominous. "They know," Dad said quietly, his voice trembling. "They know we have the drive." His words sent a wave of fear through me, but also a surge of determination. "Then we don't have much time," I said. "We need to act now." We quickly packed up the drive and decided to move it to a secure location. Dad called one of his trusted contacts, arranging for us to meet at a neutral place where the files could be safely analyzed. As we prepared to leave, Laura appeared in the doorway, her green eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone sharp. I stepped forward, my hazel eyes locking onto hers. "We know everything," I said, my voice steady. "About the contracts, about Gulfstream Holdings, about Michael. We're done playing your game." For a moment she said nothing, her expression unreadable. Then she laughed, a cold, bitter sound that sent a chill through me. "You think you've won," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. Gulfstream Holdings doesn't lose, Linda. And neither do I." Her words hung in the air, a dark promise that made my stomach churn. But I refused to back down. "Maybe they don't lose," I said. "But neither do I. And I'm going to make sure the whole world knows what you've done." Her green eyes flashed with anger, but she didn't respond. Instead, she stepped aside, letting us pass. As we left the house, the weight of what we were about to do pressed down on me. This was it, The moment we took a stand against Laura and everything she represented. But as we drove into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into a trap. The fight was far from over, and the enemy was always one step ahead. As the car disappeared into the darkness, Laura stood in the doorway, her expression cold and calculating. She pulled out her phone, dialing a number she knew by heart. "They're making their move," she said, her voice low. "Initiate phase 2. The words sent a chill down my spine, even though I couldn't hear them. The war had begun, and there was no turning back. As the car sped away from our home, the tension inside was almost unbearable. Laura's cold threat still echoed in my mind. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." She was right, I didn't. But that didn't mean I was going to back down. The USB drive in my pocket felt heavier with every passing moment, a tangible reminder of the secrets we were about to expose. My family's safety depended on what happened next, and I wasn't going to let them down. Dad had arranged for us to meet his trusted contact, a man named Alan, who worked as a cybersecurity expert. Alan had been a close friend of Dad's for years, someone he described as loyal and discreet. But as we pulled into the driveway of a secluded cabin on the outskirts of town, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The cabin was surrounded by thick woods, the only light coming from the dim porch bulb. It was the perfect place to hide, or to be ambushed. Alan greeted us at the door, his demeanor calm but his eyes sharp as he took in our anxious expressions. He was in his late 40s, with graying hair and a no-nonsense attitude that immediately put me on edge. "You must be Linda," he said, extending a hand. I shook it, noting the firm grip and the way his dark eyes lingered on mine. "Your dad told me you've uncovered something big," he said. "Let's see it." We followed him into the cabin, the interior sparse but comfortable. Alan led us to a small room filled with computer equipment, the glow of multiple monitors casting eerie shadows on the walls. "Set it here," he said, motioning to a desk. I pulled the USB drive from my pocket, hesitating for a moment before handing it over. "Be careful," I said. "This isn't just data, it's dangerous." He nodded, inserting the drive into his computer. "Let's find out what we're dealing with." As Alan worked, the rest of us sat in tense silence. The sound of his fingers tapping on the keyboard was the only noise, each keystroke a reminder of how precarious our situation was. "This is encrypted," he said after a few minutes. "Whoever put this together didn't want anyone digging into it. But I've cracked tougher codes." His confidence was reassuring, but it didn't erase the pit in my stomach. We were in uncharted territory, and every second felt like a countdown to disaster. Finally, Alan leaned back, his eyes scanning the data on the screen. "Well, this is interesting," he said, his tone laced with both intrigue and unease. "Gulfstream Holdings isn't just laundering money, they're controlling entire networks of people. Politicians, CEOs, law enforcement. They're all on the payroll." He pointed to a list of names, many of which I recognized from news headlines. "This isn't just corruption, it's a global operation." My stomach churned as I realized the scale of what we'd uncovered. This wasn't just a family matter anymore. This was a conspiracy that could change everything. "Here's something else," Alan said, pulling up a folder marked Special Projects. Inside were dozens of subfolders, each labeled with cryptic names: Cerberus, Pandora, Erebus. He clicked on one at random, revealing a series of documents and spreadsheets. "This looks like a surveillance program," he said. "They've been monitoring targets, financially, politically, even personally. Your family is in here, Linda." My heart sank as he pulled up a file labeled Project Zephyr. Inside were detailed reports on each of us, complete with photos, financial records, and psychological profiles. They knew everything. "This is worse than I thought," Dad said, his voice shaking as he looked at the screen. "They've been watching us, controlling us, for years." Alan nodded grimly. "And they're not going to let you walk away," he said. "Once you're in Gulfstream's sights, there's no escaping." His words sent a chill through me, but they also fueled my resolve. We can't let them get away with this, I said. We have to expose them. Alan gave me a long, measured look before nodding. I'll help you, he said. But you need to understand, this won't end until someone pays the price. As we planned our next steps, the cabin suddenly felt too small, too exposed. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the trees outside made my heart race. Alan must have noticed my unease because he reached for a drawer and pulled out a handgun, placing it on the desk. Just in case, he said. The sight of the weapon made everything feel real in a way it hadn't before. This wasn't just a fight for the truth. It was a fight for survival. That night, as I lay on the couch in the cabin's living room, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with questions and fears. What if Laura and Michael found us? What if Gulfstream Holdings knew we had the drive? And what if exposing them wasn't enough to stop them? The answers felt just out of reach, taunting me in the darkness. But one thing was clear. We couldn't stay hidden forever. Sooner or later, we'd have to make our move. And when we did, there'd be no turning back. As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, I realized something chilling. We weren't just fighting against Laura or Michael anymore. We were fighting against a system that thrived on silence and fear. And if we didn't find a way to break it, we'd be the ones broken. The morning sunlight streaming through the cabin's windows did little to ease the tension that hung heavy in the air. The revelations from the night before played on a loop in my mind. Gulfstream Holdings wasn't just a shadowy corporation. It was a network of control, manipulation, and fear, and we were squarely in its crosshairs. We couldn't face this alone, but the question was, who could we trust? Alan sat at his desk, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he continued to dig through the files on the USB drive. Dad stood behind him, his brow furrowed as he studied the documents. Ethan and Liam sat on the couch, their postures tense, while I paced the room, trying to make sense of everything. We need allies, I said finally, breaking the heavy silence. People who can help us expose this. Alan glanced up from the screen, his expression unreadable. That's easier said than done, he said. Gulfstream has its hooks in every major institution. The people you think you can trust might already be compromised. His words sent a chill through me, but I refused to back down. There has to be someone, I said. Someone outside their reach. Alan hesitated, then nodded slowly. There might be one person, he said. But it's a long shot. He pulled up a contact on his phone, showing me the name Rachel Greer. She's a journalist, he explained. One of the few who still has the guts to take on stories like this. She's been digging into Gulfstream for years, but she's never been able to get enough proof. This could be her chance. I felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly tempered by doubt. Can we trust her? Yes. Alan nodded. If anyone can help you, it's Rachel. But reaching out to her won't be easy. If Gulfstream gets wind of it, they'll shut her down before she can do anything. The room fell silent as we considered the risks. Reaching out to Rachel was a gamble, but it was the best option we had. Let's do it, I said finally, my voice steady. Alan nodded and began typing, setting up an encrypted message to contact her. The rest of us watched in tense silence, the weight of the decision pressing down on us. If this went wrong, it could cost us everything. As Alan worked, I turned to Dad. How do you know Alan? I asked, desperate to distract myself from the growing anxiety. Dad gave me a small smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. We worked together years ago, he said. He's the one who taught me how to spot the cracks in a system. Without him, I'd have been lost a long time ago. His words were reassuring, but they also made me realize how much Dad had kept from us. How many other secrets had he been hiding? An hour later, Alan's phone buzzed with a response. She's in, he said. His voice calm but his expression tense. She wants to meet tonight, but she's insisting on a secure location. My heart pounded as I considered the implications. This was it, the first real step in exposing Gulfstream Holdings. But it also meant taking the fight to them, and that was a dangerous move. Where does she want to meet? Yes. Alan pulled up the details. An abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It's risky, but it's the best chance we've got. We spent the rest of the day preparing. Alan encrypted the USB drive further, creating multiple copies to ensure the data couldn't be lost. Ethan and Liam helped Dad pack supplies, while I worked with Alan to review the files we planned to share with Rachel. Each document was a smoking gun, a piece of the puzzle that could bring Gulfstream Holdings to its knees. But as we reviewed the evidence, a nagging feeling crept over me. Gulfstream wouldn't let this go without a fight. That evening we piled into Alan's car, the USB drive secured in a locked case. The drive to the warehouse was tense, the silence broken only by the occasional comment from Alan about security protocols. As we approached the location, my anxiety spiked. The warehouse loomed in the distance, its broken windows and graffiti-covered walls giving it an ominous appearance. "This is it," Alan said, pulling into the parking lot. "Stay alert." Rachel was already there, waiting in a dark corner of the lot. She was in her late 30s, with sharp features and an intensity that made her seem taller than she was. "You must be Linda," she said, extending a hand. Her grip was firm, her dark eyes scanning me as if assessing my worth. "Alan told me you have something big," she said. "Let's see it." I handed her the case, my heart pounding as she opened it and plugged the drive into her laptop. For the next hour, Rachel reviewed the files, her expression shifting from focused to horrified. "This is massive," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "If even half of this is true, it could take down Gulfstream Holdings and everyone connected to them." Her words sent a flicker of hope through me, but it was quickly overshadowed by a chilling realization. "If we're going to do this," Rachel continued, "we have to be ready for the fallout. They won't go down without a fight." As Rachel closed her laptop and looked at me, her expression was a mix of determination and fear. "You've started a war," she said. "The question is, are you ready to finish it?" Her words hung in the air, heavy with implications I didn't yet understand. But as I looked at my family, I knew one thing for sure: we had no choice. The fight was just beginning. Rachel's warning echoed in my mind as we left the warehouse. "You've started a war. The question is, are you ready to finish it?" Her words were as much a challenge as they were a truth. Gulfstream Holdings wouldn't let us go quietly, but that was a risk we had to take. This wasn't just about exposing Laura anymore. It was about dismantling the web of lies and power that had entangled our family and countless others. The ride back to the cabin was tense. Rachel had insisted on taking the USB drive with her, promising to create backups and send the files to her most trusted contacts. I knew it was the right move, but watching her walk away with the only tangible evidence we had made me feel vulnerable. "What if they get to her?" Liam asked, breaking the silence. His voice trembled, his light brown eyes wide with fear. I didn't have an answer, but I forced myself to sound confident. "She knows what she's doing," I said. "We have to trust her." The next day, Rachel kept her promise. By noon, snippets of the Gulfstream Holdings files began to surface online, carefully released to avoid immediate detection. The first leaks were subtle, a damning email here, a suspicious transaction there. They were enough to raise eyebrows but not enough to draw Gulfstream's full wrath. It was a calculated move, designed to build momentum without tipping our hand too soon. "It's smart," Alan said as we monitored the responses. "They'll dismiss the first leaks as conspiracy theories, but the more that comes out, the harder it'll be to ignore." But Gulfstream wasn't the only one watching. The initial leaks drew immediate attention from independent journalists, watchdog groups, and online communities. Discussions exploded on social media, with hashtags like #ExposeGulfstream and #ShadowConspiracy trending within hours. For the first time I felt a flicker of hope. People were starting to pay attention, and Gulfstream's invincibility was beginning to crack. But hope quickly turned to dread when we received Rachel's next message. It was a short video, sent through an encrypted channel. Rachel's face appeared on the screen, her expression tense but composed. "They know," she said, her voice low. The leaks have caught their attention and they're moving fast. I've already had to change locations twice. We have to escalate. Release everything before they can shut us down. Her words sent a chill through me, but I knew she was right. The longer we waited, the more dangerous it became. Alan worked quickly, coordinating with Rachel to release a second wave of leaks. This time, the files were more direct. Documents that tied Gulfstream Holdings to specific individuals and institutions. Politicians, CEOs, even members of law enforcement were implicated. Their names and actions laid bare for the world to see. The fallout was immediate. News outlets picked up the story, and public outrage began to build. Gulfstream's once untouchable reputation was crumbling, but we knew it wouldn't last long. They're going to hit back, Ethan said, his blue eyes scanning the news feeds. They won't let this go without a fight. His words were proven true just hours later. Alan's system detected a breach attempt. Someone was trying to trace the source of the leaks. They're good, Alan said, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he worked to block the intrusion. But not good enough. He managed to secure the system, but the attack left us shaken. Gulfstream wasn't just watching, they were hunting. That night I couldn't sleep. The cabin felt too quiet, too exposed, and the weight of what we'd done pressed down on me like a physical force. I found Dad in the living room, staring out the window into the darkness. "You should be resting," he said without turning around. I joined him, my arms wrapped around myself as if to ward off the chill. "I can't stop thinking," I admitted, "about what happens next." He finally looked at me, his expression a mix of pride and worry. "Whatever happens, we face it together," he said. His words were comforting, but they didn't erase the fear gnawing at me. The next morning, the escalation we'd feared became a reality. Rachel sent another message, this time with a tone of urgency that made my blood run cold. "They've traced the leaks to me," she said. "I'm fine for now, but I don't know how long I can keep this up. You need to prepare yourselves. They're coming for you next." Her warning sent us into action. Alan reinforced our security measures, while Ethan and Liam worked with Dad to prepare for an evacuation if it came to that. The cabin no longer felt like a safe haven. It felt like a target. As the day wore on, the tension in the cabin reached a breaking point. Every sound, every shadow outside felt like a threat. Alan's system detected another intrusion attempt, this one more sophisticated than before. "They're getting closer," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "We don't have much time." I looked at him, my chest tight with fear and resolve. "Then we need to act now," I said. "Release everything. Every file, every name. If we're going down, we're taking them with us." As Alan began the process of releasing the full contents of the USB drive, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were crossing a line we couldn't come back from. The fight against Gulfstream Holdings had become a battle for survival, and the stakes had never been higher. The truth was out there now, but so were we. And as I looked at my family, I realized that the real war was only just beginning. The tension in the cabin was suffocating. Every second felt like an eternity as we waited for Alan to finish releasing the files. The air was thick with fear and anticipation, but beneath it all was a quiet resolve. We had crossed a line, one that could never be uncrossed, and there was no turning back. This was our stand, our chance to expose Gulfstream Holdings and everything they had done. But as the truth spread, so did the danger. Alan's fingers moved swiftly over the keyboard, his focus unshakable as he worked to upload the files to multiple platforms. "We need to scatter this," he said, his voice steady despite the urgency. "If they shut down one source, the others will keep it alive." His words were practical, but they couldn't erase the growing fear in the room. Gulfstream's retaliation was inevitable, and we could already feel the walls closing in. As the first wave of files went live, the impact was immediate. Social media exploded with discussions, hashtags like #ExposeGulfstream trending within minutes. News outlets picked up the story, their headlines bold and damning: "Global Power Network Exposed, Corruption at the Highest Levels." For a moment it felt like we were winning. But that victory was short-lived. Alan's system flagged a new alert, a coordinated effort to trace our location. "They're coming," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "We need to move." Panic rippled through the room as we scrambled to gather our things. Alan worked to wipe his system, ensuring there was no trace of our activity. "Where do we go?" Liam asked, his light brown eyes wide with fear. Dad placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We'll figure it out," he said, though his voice betrayed his uncertainty. I tried to stay calm, but my mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Gulfstream's reach was vast, and nowhere felt truly safe. As we loaded into Alan's car, I couldn't help but glance back at the cabin. It had been our refuge, a place where we had started to fight back. But now it felt like a tomb, a reminder of how close we were to losing everything. "We'll find another safe house," Alan said, his tone brisk as he navigated the winding roads. "But we need to lay low for a while. The next move has to be strategic." His words were logical, but they did little to ease the growing knot in my stomach. We drove for hours, the silence in the car broken only by the occasional update from Alan. "The files are holding," he said, glancing at his laptop. "People are sharing them faster than Gulfstream can take them down. But it's only a matter of time before they escalate." His words sent a chill through me, but they also fueled my determination. We were making progress, and that was something Gulfstream couldn't ignore. We arrived at the new safe house, a run-down motel on the outskirts of a small town. It wasn't much, but it was hidden, and that was what we needed most. Alan immediately set up his equipment, creating a makeshift command center in one of the rooms. The rest of us settled in as best we could, though the tension was palpable. Liam paced the room, his movements jittery, while Ethan sat silently in the corner, his blue eyes fixed on the floor. Dad tried to reassure us, but even his steady presence felt fragile. "What happens now?" Ethan asked finally, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a weariness that hadn't been there before. Alan looked up from his laptop, his expression grim. "Now we wait," he said. "And we prepare for their next move." The room fell silent again, the weight of his words settling over us like a heavy blanket. Waiting felt like the hardest thing to do, but it was all we could do. That night, as I lay on the motel bed, my mind raced with questions. What would Gulfstream do next? How far were they willing to go to protect their secrets? And what would happen to us if they found us? The uncertainty was suffocating, but it also reminded me of why we were fighting. This wasn't just about my family. It was about exposing a system that thrived on fear and corruption. And if we didn't stop it, who would? Just as I started to drift off, Alan's urgent voice jolted me awake. "We've got a problem," he said, his face illuminated by the glow of his laptop. The rest of the family quickly gathered around him, the fear in the room palpable. "They've escalated," he said, pulling up a live feed. The screen showed a news anchor reporting on the leaks, but the story had taken a dark turn. Gulfstream Holdings was already spinning the narrative, calling the leaks a coordinated attack by rogue hackers. They were discrediting us, framing us as criminals to justify whatever came next. "They're trying to control the story," I said, my voice shaking with anger. Alan nodded, his expression grim. "And it's working," he said. "People are starting to doubt the leaks, questioning their validity. If we don't act fast, everything we've done will be for nothing." His words hit like a punch to the gut, but they also reignited the fire in me. "Then we fight back," I said, my hazel eyes blazing with determination. "We release everything. Every file, every name, every crime. If they want a war, we'll give them one." Alan hesitated for a moment before nodding. "It's risky," he said, "but it might be our only chance." As he began preparing the final release, I looked at my family, their faces a mix of fear and resolve. This was it, the turning point. Gulfstream Holdings had drawn their line in the sand, and now it was our turn to cross it. The war wasn't just coming. It had already begun. The air in the motel room was electric, charged with tension and fear. Gulfstream Holdings had made their move, twisting the narrative to paint us as villains. It was a calculated play, one designed to discredit the leaks and silence us for good. But instead of scaring us into submission, it only strengthened our resolve. If they wanted a war, they were about to get one. Alan worked tirelessly at his makeshift command center, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he prepared the final release. "This is everything," he said, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "Every name, every account, every crime. Once this goes live, there's no coming back." His words sent a chill through me, but I nodded. "Do it," I said. "It's the only way to stop them." The rest of us gathered around him, our faces tense as we watched the progress bar on his screen. Ethan stood with his arms crossed, his blue eyes fixed on the monitor. Liam paced the room, his light brown eyes darting between us and the door. Dad sat quietly in the corner, his expression unreadable but his presence steady. The gravity of what we were about to do hung heavy in the air, but no one wavered. This was our stand, and we were ready to see it through. "Here we go," Alan said as he hit the final key. The screen flashed as the files began to upload to dozens of platforms simultaneously. The room was silent except for the hum of the computer, each second feeling like an eternity. Finally, the upload completed, and Alan leaned back with a deep breath. "It's done," he said. "The world knows now." The immediate aftermath was a mix of relief and anxiety. Social media exploded with the full release, the hashtags #ExposeGulfstream and #GlobalCorruption trending within minutes. News outlets scrambled to cover the story, their headlines growing more damning by the hour. Leaked files expose global conspiracy, Gulfstream Holdings at the center of corruption scandal. For a brief moment it felt like we had won. But that feeling didn't last. Alan's system flagged a new alert, a coordinated attack on every platform hosting the files. Gulfstream Holdings was pulling out all the stops, using their vast resources to suppress the leaks. "They're faster than I expected," Alan muttered, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he worked to counter their efforts. "But they can't erase it completely. Too many people have seen it." His words were a small comfort, but they didn't erase the knot of fear in my stomach. Just as we thought things couldn't get worse, the power in the motel room flickered and went out. The room was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the glow of Alan's laptop battery. "What's happening?" Liam asked, his voice trembling. Alan's face was illuminated by the screen as he typed furiously. "They're trying to isolate us," he said. "Cutting off our power, our communication. They want to force us out." The sound of footsteps outside made my heart stop. Ethan moved to the window, peeking through the blinds. "There's a car," he said, his voice low but tense. "And people. They're here." The room erupted into chaos as we scrambled to gather our things. Alan quickly shut down his system, grabbing the hard drives and shoving them into his bag. "We need to move," he said. "Now." We slipped out the back door, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. The motel parking lot was eerily quiet, the only sounds coming from our hurried footsteps. I glanced over my shoulder, my chest tight with fear as I saw shadows moving near the building. "They're close," Dad said, his voice calm but urgent. "We need to split up." His words sent a jolt through me, but I knew he was right. Staying together made us an easy target. Alan handed me one of the hard drives, his dark eyes locking onto mine. "Take this," he said. "It's a backup. If anything happens, you make sure this gets out." I nodded, my hands trembling as I took the drive. "Be careful," he said, his voice softer now. "All of you." We exchanged a brief, tense look before he turned and disappeared into the shadows, taking Ethan with him. Liam and I followed Dad in the opposite direction, the hard drive feeling like a lead weight in my pocket. As we ran through the empty streets, the reality of what we were facing hit me with full force. Gulfstream Holdings wasn't just a shadowy corporation. They were a force of nature, relentless and unforgiving. And we were a family trying to survive in their storm. But even as fear gripped me, a spark of hope flickered in the back of my mind. The files were out there now, and no matter what happened to us, the truth couldn't be erased. As we disappeared into the night, the sound of approaching sirens echoed in the distance. The war wasn't over, but we had dealt a devastating blow. And as I clutched the hard drive in my pocket, I knew one thing for certain. No matter what it cost, we weren't going to stop until Gulfstream Holdings was brought to its knees. The night air was cold, biting against my skin as we moved through the darkened streets. The weight of the hard drive in my pocket was a constant reminder of what was at stake. Gulfstream Holdings wasn't just retaliating, they were hunting us. And yet, as terrifying as the thought was, it also fueled my determination. We had released the truth, and no matter what happened next, the world was watching. Liam kept glancing over his shoulder, his light brown eyes wide with fear. "Do you think they saw us?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Dad, walking ahead, shook his head but didn't slow his pace. "Doesn't matter," he said. "We keep moving until we're safe." His calm tone was reassuring, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand hovered near the small flashlight in his jacket pocket. We made our way to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, a location Alan had suggested as a potential fallback. It was dark and silent, the perfect place to disappear, at least for a little while. Dad pushed open the rusted door, the sound echoing through the empty space. "Stay quiet," he said, motioning for us to follow. We slipped inside, the darkness swallowing us whole. The warehouse was vast, its high ceilings and empty shelves creating a sense of isolation. Liam and I stayed close to Dad as he scouted the area, checking for any signs of danger. "It's clear," he said finally, his voice low. "We'll rest here for now." I nodded, though my mind was already racing. How long could we keep this up? How long before Gulfstream found us again? I sat on the cold concrete floor, my back against a metal beam. Liam paced nervously, his movements restless and jittery. "We can't keep running forever," he said, his voice breaking. "They'll find us no matter where we go." Dad placed a hand on his shoulder, his expression firm but kind. "We don't stop until this is over," he said. "We've come too far to give up now." His words were meant to comfort, but they only made the weight of our situation feel heavier. As we tried to settle in, the sound of a phone vibrating broke the silence. I pulled mine from my pocket, the screen glowing with a message from Alan. "Safe for now. They're scrambling to contain the leaks. Keep moving." Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. If Gulfstream was scrambling, it meant the leaks were working, but it also meant their retaliation would be swift and brutal. "What did he say?" Liam asked, his voice trembling. I showed him the message, watching as his expression shifted from fear to determination. "If they're scrambling, that means we're winning," he said, his light brown eyes blazing. I nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. But that hope was quickly overshadowed by the reality of our situation. We might be winning the battle, but the war was far from over. Dad pulled a map from his bag, spreading it out on the floor. "We need to plan our next move," he said. "Staying here too long is risky." He traced a route with his finger, pointing to a remote cabin in the mountains. "This is where we'll go next. It's isolated and hard to reach. If we can make it there, we'll have a better chance of staying hidden." His plan made sense, but the thought of traveling even farther into the unknown filled me with dread. "How do we know it's safe?" Liam asked, voicing the question we were all thinking. Dad hesitated, his brow furrowing. "We don't," he admitted. "But it's our best option right now." His honesty was both reassuring and terrifying. There were no guarantees, no certainties. All we could do was keep moving and hope for the best. Just as we began packing up, the sound of a car engine reached our ears. We froze, our eyes darting toward the warehouse door. The engine grew louder, the headlights casting long shadows through the cracks in the metal walls. "They've found us," Dad said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Get to the back exit. Now." Panic surged through me as we scrambled to gather our things. Dad led the way, his flashlight guiding us through the maze of shelves and crates. Liam clung to my arm, his grip tight as we moved as quickly and quietly as we could. The sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse, growing closer with each passing second. My heart pounded in my chest, the fear nearly overwhelming. We reached the back exit, a heavy metal door that Dad pushed open with all his strength. The night air hit me like a slap, cold and biting, but I barely noticed. We ran into the darkness, the sound of voices behind us growing fainter with each step. When we finally stopped, gasping for breath, I realized we had made it, at least for now. But the danger was far from over. As we stood in the shadows, catching our breath, I realized something chilling. Gulfstream wasn't just chasing us, they were hunting us. And no matter how far we ran, they wouldn't stop until we were silenced. But as I looked at Liam and Dad, their faces filled with resolve, I knew one thing for sure. Neither would we. The moon hung low in the sky, casting faint light over the rugged terrain as we pressed forward. Every step felt heavier, every shadow a potential threat. We had narrowly escaped Gulfstream's agents at the warehouse, but the chase had only just begun. They were relentless, and no matter how far we ran, I could feel their presence closing in like a tightening noose. But giving up wasn't an option. Not now. Not ever. Liam was breathing hard, his steps faltering as we navigated the uneven ground. "I can't keep going," he said, his voice strained. Dad stopped, turning back to him with a firm but understanding look. "You can," he said. "We're almost there." His voice carried a confidence I envied, but I knew it was as much for Liam's sake as it was for his own. We couldn't afford to stop, not with Gulfstream's hunters surely still on our trail. Alan had sent another message, this time with coordinates for a new rendezvous point, a small cabin nestled deep in the woods, miles from the nearest road. It was a calculated risk, but it was our best chance to regroup and plan our next move. The hard drive in my pocket felt like a ticking time bomb, its contents the only leverage we had against the powerful machine chasing us. The thought of losing it, of everything we'd worked for unraveling, made my chest tighten. The sound of a twig snapping behind us froze me in my tracks. My heart pounded as I scanned the darkness, my hazel eyes straining to catch any movement. "Did you hear that?" Liam whispered, his voice barely audible. Dad raised a hand, motioning for us to stay quiet. The seconds stretched into an eternity as we waited, the silence pressing down on us like a physical weight. Then, just as I was about to exhale, a beam of light cut through the trees. Panic surged through me as we dove into the underbrush, pressing ourselves flat against the damp ground. The footsteps grew louder, the beam of light sweeping the area methodically. My heart felt like it was about to burst as I clutched the hard drive in my pocket, willing myself to stay silent. Spread out, a voice barked, low and authoritative. They were closer than I'd feared. Dad motioned for us to stay put as he moved silently through the trees, his movements deliberate and practiced. I wanted to stop him, to tell him it was too dangerous, but I couldn't risk making a sound. Beside me, Liam was trembling, his light brown eyes wide with fear. I placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, though my own fear threatened to overwhelm me. Minutes felt like hours as we waited in the shadows, the searchlights cutting through the darkness with precision. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made my heart race. Then, suddenly, there was a commotion in the distance. A shout, followed by the sound of footsteps running in the opposite direction. Dad's diversion had worked. The agents were moving away from us, their voices growing fainter with each passing second. We didn't wait to see if they would return. Dad reappeared, his face calm but his movements urgent. "Let's go," he said, his voice low. We moved quickly and quietly, the fear of being discovered driving us forward. The terrain grew steeper as we approached the cabin's location, the trees growing thicker and the air colder. By the time we saw the faint glow of the cabin's lights in the distance, I was too exhausted to feel relief. Alan was waiting for us at the cabin, his expression both relieved and tense as he opened the door. "You made it," he said, ushering us inside. The interior was small but cozy, the warmth of a crackling fire providing a stark contrast to the cold night outside. "We don't have much time," Alan said as he led us to a table covered in maps and equipment. "Gulfstream is escalating. They're not just hunting us anymore. They're preparing to destroy everything we've built." His words sent a chill through me, but I forced myself to focus. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at me. Alan gestured to the hard drive I had been clutching like a lifeline. "That drive is our last line of defense," he said. "It's time to make it public. Every document, every name, every transaction. If we hold back now, they'll destroy us." Dad nodded, his expression grim but resolute. "Do it," he said. "Whatever it takes, make sure the world knows the truth." Alan began working immediately, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he prepared the final upload. The rest of us gathered around the table, studying the maps and discussing our next steps. The air was thick with tension, but also with a sense of purpose. This was it, the moment we took control of the fight. Just as Alan hit the final key, the sound of approaching vehicles shattered the silence. Headlights cut through the trees, casting long shadows on the cabin walls. "They're here," Liam whispered, his voice trembling. The room erupted into action as we grabbed what we could, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. My heart pounded as I looked at Alan, his face illuminated by the glow of the screen. "It's live," he said. "The world knows now." As the first doors slammed outside, I realized there was no turning back. Gulfstream was here, and they were coming for us. But even as fear gripped me, I felt a surge of determination. The truth was out there now, and no matter what happened next, they couldn't erase it. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The faint hum of approaching engines sent a chill down my spine. We barely had time to react before the headlights pierced through the darkness, their beams sweeping over the cabin walls. Gulfstream's agents were here, and there was no more running. This was it, the moment we had been dreading and preparing for. Our fight wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about standing our ground and making sure the truth couldn't be buried. Alan moved with purpose, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he secured the final backups of the files. "They're going to try and take everything," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "We can't let that happen." Linda stood by the window, her hazel eyes fixed on the growing shadows outside. "How much time do we have?" she asked. Alan glanced at her, his expression grim. "Not enough," he replied. Ethan and Liam stood near the door, their postures tense. Liam clutched a flashlight tightly, his light brown eyes darting nervously between the door and his sister. "What do we do if they get in?" he whispered. Ethan placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We fight," he said simply. His blue eyes were steady, a calm resolve radiating from him. Despite the fear gnawing at me, his confidence gave me strength. Dad gathered us in a huddle, his voice low but firm. "Listen to me," he said, his salt and pepper hair slightly disheveled. "We don't panic. Alan's securing the files, but if anything happens, Linda, you take the hard drive and run. Don't stop until you're safe. Do you understand?" His words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I nodded. "We'll all make it out of this," I said, my voice shaking but determined. Dad's eyes softened, a flicker of pride breaking through the tension. "I hope so," he said. Alan looked up from his laptop, his dark eyes sharp. "They're jamming our signals," he said, "trying to isolate us. But I've sent the backups to an encrypted cloud. Even if they take this place, the files are out there." Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The sound of car doors slamming outside shattered the fragile calm. "They're here," Dad said, his voice tight. "Positions now." We scrambled into place, the dim cabin suddenly feeling much smaller. Alan stayed at his makeshift command center, his laptop glowing faintly in the dark. Ethan and Liam took cover near the door, while Dad and I moved to the windows, peering out cautiously. The shadows of men moved through the trees, their voices low but clear. "Sweep the perimeter," one of them barked. "No one gets out." My heart pounded as I gripped the hard drive in my pocket, its weight a constant reminder of what was at stake. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to stay. This wasn't just about us anymore. It was about the truth, about standing up to a force that thrived on fear and control. "Linda," Alan called softly, his voice breaking through my thoughts. "If they breach, you know what to do." I met his gaze, nodding. "I won't let them take it," I said. The first crash came from the back of the cabin, a loud, splintering sound that made us all jump. "They're trying to force their way in," Dad said, his voice calm but urgent. "Stay low." Ethan moved to reinforce the door. His blue eyes narrowed with determination. "We can hold them off," he said. Liam's hands were shaking, but he nodded. His light brown eyes filled with a mix of fear and resolve. Another crash came, this time from the front. The cabin shook with the force of the assault, the air thick with tension. Alan's voice cut through the chaos. "The files are live," he said. "They can't stop it now." Relief mixed with fear as his words sank in. We had done it, the truth was out. But Gulfstream wasn't just here for the files. They were here for us. As the cabin door shuddered under the force of another blow, I realized we were out of time. This wasn't just a standoff, it was a trap. And as the first sliver of light broke through the cracked door, I knew one thing for certain. Gulfstream had underestimated us. The fight wasn't over, and we weren't going down without a fight. The cabin trembled with the force of the assault. Each crash against the door sent shockwaves through the air, a grim reminder that Gulfstream's agents were only moments away from breaking through. My heart pounded in my chest, the weight of the hard drive in my pocket grounding me. We had prepared for this moment, but nothing could truly prepare us for the fear of knowing the enemy was at our doorstep. "Stay calm," Dad said, his voice low and steady as he moved toward the window. His salt and pepper hair was damp with sweat, but his hazel eyes remained sharp. "They want us to panic. Don't give them that advantage." I nodded, gripping the hard drive tighter as I crouched behind a wooden beam. Beside me, Liam clutched a flashlight like a lifeline, his light brown eyes wide with fear. Ethan stood by the door, his back pressed against the wall. His blue eyes darted between the door and the rest of us, his expression grim but determined. "We can't let them get inside," he said, his voice firm. "We need to hold them off for as long as we can." Alan glanced up from his laptop, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the screen. "The files are safe," he said. "No matter what happens here, the truth is out. But if they take us, they'll spin the narrative their way." The next crash was louder, the door splintering under the force of a battering ram. "They're coming," Liam whispered, his voice trembling. Dad moved quickly, motioning for us to get into position. "Alan, stay with the equipment," he said. "The rest of you follow my lead." His tone left no room for argument, and we obeyed without question. This wasn't just a fight. It was a battle for survival. The first agent breached the door, his silhouette looming large in the dim light. Ethan moved swiftly, using the element of surprise to knock him back with a makeshift barricade. The agent stumbled, his weapon clattering to the floor. Before he could recover, Dad stepped forward, his movements calculated as he disarmed him and pushed him out of the cabin. "That's one," Dad muttered, his voice steady despite the chaos. But there was no time to celebrate. More agents poured in, their boots thundering against the wooden floor. Liam froze, his hands shaking as he clutched the flashlight. I grabbed his arm, pulling him behind me as I pressed against the wall. "Stay close," I whispered. "We'll get through this." His light brown eyes met mine, and for a moment I saw a flicker of trust. It was enough to give me strength. Alan's voice cut through the commotion. "They're trying to jam the signal again," he said, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "I need more time." Ethan nodded, positioning himself between Alan and the advancing agents. "You'll get it," he said, his voice firm. The tension in the room was suffocating, every movement calculated, every second critical. The next wave of agents was faster, more aggressive. One of them lunged toward Alan, but Dad intercepted him, using a chair to block the attack. The agent stumbled, giving Ethan just enough time to tackle him and push him toward the door. "Keep them out," Dad shouted, his voice ringing with authority. But the agents were relentless, their numbers seemingly endless. I moved toward Alan, my heart pounding as I shielded him with my body. "How much longer?" I asked, my voice tight with urgency. Alan didn't look up, his focus unshakable. "A few more minutes," he said. "Just hold them off." His words were a lifeline, but they also felt like a ticking clock. Time was running out, and we were running out of options. The sound of breaking glass shattered the air, and I turned to see an agent climbing through the window. Liam let out a startled cry, and I moved quickly, using a nearby lamp to knock the agent off balance. He fell back, his weapon slipping from his grasp. Liam grabbed it, his hands trembling as he pointed it toward the advancing figures. "Hey, I can't," he stammered. I placed a hand on his shoulder, my voice firm but gentle. "You don't have to," I said. "Just stay behind me." Alan let out a triumphant shout. "The files are secure," he said, his dark eyes gleaming with determination. "They can't stop it now." Relief surged through me, but it was short-lived. The agents were regrouping, their movements more coordinated as they closed in. "We need to get out of here," Dad said, his voice urgent. "Now." As we prepared to make our escape, the sound of more vehicles approaching filled the air. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. And as I clutched the hard drive, the weight of our mission pressed down on me like never before. Gulfstream had brought the fight to us, but they had underestimated one thing. We weren't going down without a fight. The air in the cabin was thick with tension, the chaos of the last attack still reverberating through the wooden walls. The sound of more vehicles approaching outside made my pulse quicken. Gulfstream wasn't letting up, and we were running out of time. The hard drive in my pocket felt heavier with every second, a reminder of what we had to protect at all costs. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a fight for the truth. "They're regrouping," Dad said, his voice steady despite the fear that flickered in his eyes. His salt and pepper hair was damp with sweat, his jaw tight. "We need to move before they get reinforcements." Alan nodded, his fingers still flying over the keyboard as he finished encrypting the remaining data. "Give me 2 minutes," he said. "I'm almost done." 2 minutes felt like an eternity, but I knew we didn't have a choice. We had to give him the time he needed. Liam was trembling beside me, his light brown eyes darting between the door and the window. "What if they come back before we're ready?" he whispered. I placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, forcing a calm I didn't feel. "We'll handle it," I said. "We've gotten this far. We can do this." My words were meant to comfort him, but they also gave me a flicker of courage. We had no choice but to fight. Ethan stood near the door, his blue eyes scanning the room for anything that could be used as a weapon. "They'll come through the windows next," he said, his voice low but steady. "We need to block them off." Dad nodded, moving quickly to pile furniture in front of the largest window. I helped him, the strain of lifting heavy objects momentarily distracting me from the fear clawing at my chest. The sound of a car door slamming outside froze me in place. Ethan motioned for everyone to stay quiet, his blue eyes narrowing as he moved to the window. "They're here," he whispered, his tone grim. I clenched my fists, my heart pounding as I glanced at Alan. "How much longer?" I asked, my voice tight. He didn't look up, his focus unshakable. 1 minute, he said. "Just keep them out for 1 more minute." The first agent appeared at the window, his silhouette barely visible in the moonlight. Ethan moved quickly, using a makeshift barricade to knock him back. The agent stumbled, but more were already closing in. Liam let out a strangled cry as another agent tried to climb through the window. "I've got this," Dad shouted, grabbing a broken chair and shoving the agent back. The clash was chaotic, every movement a fight for survival. Finally, Alan let out a triumphant shout. "It's done," he said, his dark eyes gleaming with relief. "The files are encrypted and uploaded. They can't stop it now." His words gave me a surge of hope, but it was short-lived. The agents were closing in, their movements more coordinated as they surrounded the cabin. "We have to go," Dad shouted, his voice cutting through the commotion. "Now!" We moved quickly, grabbing only what we could carry. Alan led the way, his bag of equipment slung over his shoulder. Ethan and Dad flanked him, their postures tense as they scanned the shadows for threats. Liam stayed close to me, his breathing shallow as he clutched a flashlight like a weapon. The cold night air hit me like a slap as we stepped outside, the sound of approaching engines growing louder. "Stay low and keep moving," Dad said, his voice calm but urgent. We darted through the trees, the dense forest providing a semblance of cover. The beams of flashlights cut through the darkness, the agents' voices growing louder as they pursued us. My chest tightened as I realized how close they were. Every step felt like a gamble, every sound a potential threat. We reached a small ravine, the icy water glinting faintly in the moonlight. "We have to cross," Alan said, his voice breathless. Ethan nodded, stepping into the water first. It was freezing, the cold biting into my skin as we waded through. Liam stumbled, but I caught him, pulling him upright as we moved as quickly as we could. The sound of shouts behind us spurred us forward, adrenaline driving us despite the exhaustion. On the other side of the ravine, we found a narrow trail that led deeper into the forest. Alan paused, glancing back at the pursuing agents. "This way," he said, motioning for us to follow. The trail was uneven, the thick underbrush slowing us down. My lungs burned with each breath, but I refused to stop. The hard drive in my pocket felt like a lifeline, its contents our only chance at bringing Gulfstream down. As we disappeared into the shadows of the forest, the sound of footsteps behind us grew fainter. For now we had escape. But as I clutched the hard drive, the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on me. This wasn't just a narrow escape, it was a temporary reprieve. And as the darkness closed in around us, I knew one thing for certain. The fight was far from over. The forest was silent except for the sound of our ragged breathing and the faint rustling of leaves underfoot. We had escaped for now. But the weight of what we had just endured hung heavily in the air, and the relentless pursuit by Gulfstream's agents loomed like a shadow over every step we took. The darkness of the woods wrapped around us, isolating us from the world, yet we knew it was only a matter of time before they found us again. We needed a plan, and we needed it fast. "This way," Alan whispered, his voice barely audible as he led us deeper into the forest. His face was illuminated by the faint glow of the GPS device in his hand, his expression focused but strained. "There's a clearing about half a mile ahead," he said. "We can stop there to regroup." I nodded, clutching the hard drive in my pocket as if it were the only thing tethering me to reality. Liam stumbled beside me, his light brown eyes wide with exhaustion. "How much longer do we have to keep running?" he asked, his voice trembling. I placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to steady him. "Not much longer," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. The clearing was small, surrounded by tall trees that formed a natural barrier. Alan stopped at the center, immediately setting up his equipment on a flat rock. Dad and Ethan began scouting the perimeter, their postures tense and alert. Liam sank to the ground, his breathing labored as he tried to catch his breath. I crouched beside him, my hazel eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. "We're safe here," Alan said, though his tone carried more hope than certainty. Alan worked quickly, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he checked the status of the uploaded files. "The data is holding," he said, his dark eyes scanning the screen. "It's spreading faster than they can contain it." Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. "That means they'll double their efforts to find us," Dad said as he returned from the perimeter. His salt and pepper hair was damp with sweat. His expression grim. "We can't stay here long." "What's the plan then?" Ethan asked, his blue eyes narrowing as he leaned against a tree. "We can't keep running forever." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth. I glanced at Alan, who was still focused on his laptop. "We need a diversion," Alan said finally. His voice calm but decisive. "Something to draw their attention away from us while we find a more permanent solution." "What kind of diversion?" I asked, my heart sinking at the thought of splitting up. Alan hesitated, his fingers pausing over the keyboard. "We use the files," he said. "Release another wave of information, something big enough to force Gulfstream to shift their focus." His suggestion was met with silence, the gravity of the idea sinking in. "That could work," Dad said finally, his tone thoughtful. "But it's risky. They'll know it's us." "They already know it's us," Ethan said, his voice steady. "The question is, how do we make it count?" Alan nodded, his dark eyes meeting Ethan's. "We target their leadership," he said. "Expose the people pulling the strings. It's the only way to destabilize them enough to buy us time." The room fell silent again as we considered the implications. Targeting Gulfstream's leaders meant escalating the fight to a level we hadn't yet reached. But it also meant giving ourselves a fighting chance. "I'll do it," I said, breaking the silence. All eyes turned to me, surprise and concern written on their faces. "If we're going to do this, we need to act now," I continued. "I can release the files while you all stay hidden." Dad stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "You can't do this alone," he said. "It's too dangerous." I met his gaze, my resolve unwavering. "It's the only way," I said. "We can't afford to wait." Alan hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I can set it up," he said. "But we'll need to move fast. The longer we stay here, the greater the risk." He began typing again, his movements precise as he prepared the next wave of leaks. Meanwhile, Dad and Ethan worked to gather supplies, their movements efficient but tense. Liam stayed close to me, his fear evident but his trust unwavering. "Are you sure about this?" he asked quietly. I nodded, my hazel eyes meeting his. "We don't have a choice," I said. The sound of distant footsteps sent a chill down my spine. "They're coming," Ethan said, his voice low but urgent. Alan worked faster, his fingers blurring over the keys. "Just a few more seconds," he said. The tension was suffocating as we waited, every sound amplified by the stillness of the forest. Finally, Alan looked up, his expression both relieved and resolute. "It's done," he said. "The files are live." As the footsteps grew louder, we prepared to move again. The diversion was in place, but the danger was far from over. And as I clutched the hard drive, the weight of what we had done pressed down on me. Gulfstream's fury was coming, and we were about to face it head-on. The fight wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about finishing what we started. The forest was quiet, too quiet. The distant footsteps that had haunted us just moments before had faded into silence, but the tension in the air was palpable. Gulfstream's agents were out there, searching, hunting. Every second felt like borrowed time as we finalized the plan that could either save us or doom us. The diversion Alan had suggested wasn't just risky. It was the most dangerous move we had made yet. But it was also our best chance to escape. "Here's the plan," Alan said, his voice steady as he addressed the group. His dark eyes were sharp, focused, as he laid out the details. "We're going to release a set of files targeting Gulfstream's leadership, specific names, accounts, and their most damning secrets. The goal is to draw their attention away from us long enough for the rest of you to move to the safe house." He looked at me, his expression serious. "But someone needs to stay behind to make sure the upload completes." The weight of his words settled over the group like a heavy fog. Liam's light brown eyes darted nervously between Alan and me, his fear palpable. "You can't stay here," Liam said, his voice trembling. "It's too dangerous." I placed a hand on his shoulder, my gaze steady. "We don't have a choice," I said. "If we don't do this, they'll find us no matter where we go." Dad stepped forward, his salt and pepper hair disheveled but his posture resolute. "I'll stay," he said, his hazel eyes meeting mine. "You take the others and get to safety." His words sent a jolt through me, but I shook my head. "No," I said firmly. "This is my fight too. I'll stay and finish what we started." The room fell silent, the weight of my decision hanging heavy in the air. Ethan broke the silence, his blue eyes narrowing as he spoke. "We'll stay together," he said, his voice calm but firm. "If we split up, we're weaker. We're stronger as a team." His words sparked a flicker of hope in me, but I knew the risks. "If we all stay, we're putting everyone at risk," I said. "We need to be smart about this." Alan nodded, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he prepared the files for release. "Linda's right," he said. "This isn't about bravery. It's about survival." The sound of an alert on Alan's laptop broke the tension. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening. "They're close," he said, his voice tight. "We need to move now." The plan was simple but fraught with danger. Alan and I would stay behind to oversee the upload, while Dad, Ethan, and Liam would head to the safe house. The goal was to create enough chaos within Gulfstream's ranks to buy them time to escape. It was a gamble, but it was all we had. "Take this," Alan said, handing Dad a USB drive containing the most critical files. "If anything happens to us, make sure these get to the right people." Dad nodded, his grip on the drive firm. "We'll see you on the other side," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. As the group prepared to leave, I hugged Liam tightly, my heart heavy. "Stay safe," I whispered. He nodded, his light brown eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You too," he said. As the others disappeared into the forest, Alan and I turned our attention to the laptop. The files were ready, queued for release, but the process was slow. "They're jamming the signal," Alan muttered, his dark eyes scanning the screen. "We'll need to boost the transmission." He motioned for me to grab a portable antenna from his bag. As I set it up, the sound of rustling in the bushes sent a chill down my spine. "They're here," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The first agent appeared at the edge of the clearing, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light. Alan worked quickly, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he whispered, "Keep them distracted." My chest tightened as I grabbed a nearby flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. I pointed it toward the agent, hoping to disorient him long enough for Alan to finish. The agent hesitated, his hand hovering near his weapon. "You don't want to do this," I called, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at me. "Walk away now, and no one gets hurt." The agent didn't respond, but his hesitation gave Alan the time he needed. "It's live," Alan said, his voice low but triumphant. "The files are out there." Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. More agents emerged from the shadows, their movements coordinated and purposeful. Alan grabbed the laptop, stuffing it into his bag as he motioned for me to follow. "We need to move," he shouted. We darted through the trees, the sound of agents pursuing us growing louder with every step. My lungs burned as I ran, the hard drive in my pocket bouncing with each movement. Alan led the way, his GPS device glowing faintly in the darkness. "There's a ridge up ahead," he said, his voice breathless. "If we can make it there, we'll have the high ground." His words gave me a flicker of hope, but the sound of gunfire shattered it. They were closing in. As we reached the edge of the ridge, Alan turned to me, his dark eyes filled with determination. "Keep running," he said. "I'll hold them off." His words sent a jolt through me, but before I could protest, he was gone, disappearing into the shadows. I hesitated for a moment, the weight of the hard drive in my pocket grounding me. Then, with a deep breath, I turned and ran, the sound of footsteps and gunfire echoing behind me. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. The darkness of the forest closed in around me as I ran, my legs burning with every step. Alan's words echoed in my ears. Keep running. I'll hold them off. I didn't want to leave him, but I knew he was right. The hard drive in my pocket was our lifeline, our one chance to bring Gulfstream Holdings down. And if Alan's sacrifice was what it took to protect that chance, I had to honor it. Behind me, the sound of gunfire shattered the stillness of the night. My heart clenched as I thought of Alan, standing his ground against impossible odds. He was buying me time, but at what cost? Tears stung my eyes, but I forced myself to focus. If I stopped, even for a second, his sacrifice would be for nothing. The forest was dense, the terrain uneven and treacherous. My flashlight cast eerie shadows on the trees, every flicker of movement making my pulse race. The weight of the hard drive in my pocket was a constant reminder of what was at stake. I couldn't let them catch me. Not now, not after everything we'd done to expose the truth. Up ahead, I saw the faint glow of a clearing. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pushed myself forward, the sound of pursuit still echoing behind me. I stumbled into the open space, my knees nearly buckling under the strain. But there was no time to rest. I scanned the area, my hazel eyes darting between the shadows, searching for a place to hide or a path to safety. The clearing was small, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to close in like sentinels. I moved toward a cluster of rocks, crouching low as I tried to steady my breathing. The sound of footsteps grew louder, the agents' voices cutting through the night. Spread out, one of them barked. She can't have gone far. My heart pounded as I pressed myself against the cold stone, willing myself to stay silent. Suddenly, the sound of a distant explosion rocked the forest, the ground beneath me trembling with the force. The agents froze, their flashlights swinging wildly as they tried to locate the source. My mind raced. Was it Alan? Had he set some kind of trap? The thought filled me with equal parts hope and dread. He was still fighting, it meant he was still alive. But for how long? The explosion seemed to disorient the agents, their movements growing more erratic as they shouted orders and scanned the area. Taking advantage of the chaos, I slipped away from my hiding spot, moving carefully through the underbrush. Every step felt like a gamble, every crack of a twig underfoot a potential giveaway. But I had no choice. I had to keep moving. As I crept through the forest, my thoughts kept drifting back to Alan. He had been so calm, so composed, even in the face of danger. His sacrifice wasn't just an act of bravery, it was a testament to his belief in our cause. But the thought of losing him, of never seeing him again, was almost too much to bear. I swallowed the lump in my throat, forcing myself to focus. I couldn't afford to break down, not now. The forest began to thin, the trees giving way to a narrow trail that stretched into the distance. I followed it, my legs aching but my resolve unshaken. The sound of pursuit had grown fainter, but I knew better than to let my guard down. Gulfstream's agents were relentless, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted, or until I was silenced. Just as I thought I might have lost them, the sound of a voice stopped me in my tracks. Linda. It was Alan's voice, faint but unmistakable. My heart leapt as I turned toward the sound, my feet moving before I could think. I followed the voice, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, until I saw him. He was leaning against a tree, his face pale but determined. "You made it," he said, his voice weak but filled with relief. Relief flooded through me as I reached his side, but it was quickly replaced by dread. Alan's leg was injured, blood seeping through the fabric of his jeans. "We need to get you out of here," I said, my voice trembling. He shook his head, his dark eyes locking onto mine. "No," he said firmly. "You need to keep going. Take the hard drive and get to the safe house. I'll hold them off." Tears blurred my vision as I tried to protest, but Alan's expression was resolute. "This is bigger than me, Linda," he said. "It's bigger than all of us. You know what you have to do." His words broke something inside me, but I knew he was right. With a heavy heart I nodded, gripping the hard drive tightly. "I won't let this be for nothing," I said, my voice steady despite the tears streaming down my face. As I turned to leave, the sound of footsteps grew louder, the agents closing in once again. Alan raised his weapon, his posture strong despite his injury. "Go," he shouted. I hesitated for only a moment before running into the darkness, the sound of gunfire echoing behind me. I didn't look back. Couldn't. All I could do was hope that Alan's sacrifice would be enough to give us the chance we so desperately needed. The fight wasn't over, but it was far from won. The forest swallowed me as I ran, the sound of gunfire fading into the distance. Alan's voice still echoed in my mind. "Go." My legs burned, my chest heaved with every breath, but I couldn't stop. The hard drive in my pocket felt like a lifeline, its contents the culmination of everything we had risked, everything we had lost. Alan's sacrifice had bought me time, but it was up to me to make it count. The trail ahead twisted and turned, the uneven ground threatening to trip me with every step. Moonlight filtered through the dense canopy above, casting eerie shadows on the path. I forced myself to focus, to push past the fear and exhaustion. "You're almost there," I whispered to myself, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to reassure myself or keep from breaking down. The faint glow of a structure up ahead caught my attention. My heart leapt as I realized it was the safe house, a small, unassuming cabin nestled among the trees. Relief surged through me, but it was quickly tempered by caution. Gulfstream's agents were relentless, and there was no guarantee they hadn't already found it. I slowed my pace, scanning the area for any signs of movement. The cabin was dark, its windows shuttered, the door slightly ajar. My heart pounded as I approached, every sound amplified by the oppressive silence of the forest. I reached the door, pausing for a moment to listen. There was no sound from inside, no sign of anyone. Swallowing my fear, I pushed the door open, stepping into the shadowy interior. The safe house was sparse but functional, a single room with a small table, a few chairs, and a cot pushed against the wall. A lantern sat on the table, its faint glow illuminating the space. I closed the door behind me, locking it as quietly as I could. My hands trembled as I pulled the hard drive from my pocket, placing it on the table. This was it, the last step in our plan. I powered up the small laptop Alan had prepared, its screen casting a pale light in the dim room. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, my mind racing. Alan had walked me through the upload process, but now that I was here, the weight of what I was about to do felt overwhelming. "This is bigger than you," Alan had said. "Bigger than all of us." His words steadied me as I began the upload. The progress bar moved slowly, each percentage feeling like an eternity. I kept glancing toward the door, every creak of the wood or rustle of the wind outside making my heart race. The file was massive, its contents enough to dismantle Gulfstream Holdings piece by piece. But until it was complete, I was vulnerable, and I knew they wouldn't stop until they had me. The sound of footsteps outside sent a jolt of fear through me. I froze, my hazel eyes locked on the door as the footsteps grew louder. My mind raced with possibilities. Had they found me? Was it Dad or Ethan? I reached for the small flashlight Alan had given me, gripping it tightly as I moved toward the door. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was only silence. The door shuddered as someone tried the handle. My breath caught in my throat as I pressed myself against the wall, the flashlight raised like a weapon. The door rattled again, harder this time. "Linda, it's me," a voice called softly. Relief flooded through me as I recognized Dad's voice. I quickly unlocked the door, pulling it open to reveal him and Ethan standing in the shadows. Their faces were tense, their eyes scanning the area behind them. "Are you okay?" Dad asked, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. I nodded, my hands still trembling. "The upload is almost done," I said, motioning to the laptop. Ethan moved to the window, his blue eyes sharp as he watched for any signs of pursuit. "We need to move as soon as it's finished," he said. "They're not far behind us." His words sent a chill through me, but I forced myself to stay focused. The progress bar crept closer to completion, the seconds ticking by with agonizing slowness. "What about Alan?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Dad's expression darkened, and he shook his head. "He stayed behind to give us a chance," he said. His words were a knife to my heart, but there was no time to grieve. Alan's sacrifice had brought us this far, and I couldn't let it be in vain. Just as the upload completed, the sound of vehicles approaching filled the air. My chest tightened as I grabbed the hard drive, slipping it back into my pocket. "They're here," Ethan said, his voice tense. Dad motioned for us to move toward the back exit. His hazel eyes filled with determination. "Stay low and stay quiet," he said. "We can't let them corner us." As we slipped out the back of the safe house and into the forest once again, the sound of doors slamming and voices shouting echoed behind us. The files were live, the truth exposed, but the fight wasn't over. Gulfstream was still coming, and as we disappeared into the shadows, I knew one thing for certain. This was far from the end. The real battle was only just beginning. The safe house was quiet, but the silence carried an edge like the calm before a storm. The upload was complete, the files released to the world, but the weight of what we had done pressed down on all of us. Alan's sacrifice hung heavy in the air, a stark reminder of the cost of truth. Dad and Ethan stood near the windows, watching the forest for any signs of movement. Liam sat on the floor, his knees pulled to his chest, while I clutched the hard drive in my hands, unable to let go. "It's out there now," Dad said, breaking the silence. His hazel eyes remained fixed on the dark woods outside. His voice steady but tinged with tension. "Gulfstream can't erase it, no matter how hard they try." Ethan nodded, his blue eyes scanning the perimeter. "They'll come after us harder now," he said. "We've cornered them, and they'll do anything to protect what's left of their empire." His words sent a chill through me, but I forced myself to stay focused. We had come too far to let fear consume us now. Alan's laptop still sat on the table, the screen dimmed but glowing faintly. The files were secure, their contents already spreading across the internet, but the fight was far from over. "What happens now?" Liam asked, his voice breaking the stillness. His light brown eyes were filled with fear, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the table. Dad turned to him, his expression softening. "Now we regroup," he said. "We figure out our next move." But before we could settle, the faint sound of helicopters broke through the quiet. My chest tightened as I looked at Dad, whose expression had turned grim. "They've found us," Ethan said, his voice low but urgent. The sound grew louder, the vibrations rattling the windows as the beams of searchlights swept through the trees. Panic rippled through the room as we scrambled to prepare. Dad moved quickly, grabbing a map from his bag and spreading it across the table. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice firm. "They'll surround the cabin in minutes." He traced a route with his finger, pointing to a dense section of forest nearby. "There's a network of old logging roads here," he said. "If we move fast, we can lose them." His words were met with nods, but the urgency in the room was palpable. As we packed our belongings, the sound of a voice crackled over a loudspeaker outside. "We know you're in there," the voice said, calm but commanding. "There's no escape. Surrender now, and this ends peacefully." My heart pounded as I glanced at Dad, whose jaw tightened. "They're bluffing," he said. "They don't want us, they want the files." His words steadied me, but the fear gnawed at the edges of my resolve. Ethan moved to reinforce the door, his movements swift and deliberate. "We'll go out the back," he said, his blue eyes meeting Dad's. "But we need a distraction." Dad nodded, his mind already working. "Linda, do you still have Alan's beacon?" he asked. I fumbled through my jacket pocket, pulling out the small device Alan had given me. It was designed to mimic a signal from our location, a tool meant to mislead Gulfstream's trackers. "Set it near the edge of the forest," Dad said. "It'll buy us time to get to the logging roads." I hesitated for a moment, the weight of the device in my hand feeling heavier than it should. But I nodded, knowing it was our best shot. Liam grabbed my arm, his light brown eyes wide with worry. "Be careful," he said, his voice trembling. I gave him a reassuring squeeze before stepping toward the door. The cold night air hit me as I slipped outside, the sounds of the helicopters louder now. The beams of searchlights cut through the darkness, illuminating patches of the forest in an eerie glow. I moved quickly, staying low as I made my way toward the treeline. Every step felt like a gamble, every sound amplified by the adrenaline coursing through me. I reached the edge of the forest, crouching near a fallen log as I activated the beacon. The small device blinked to life, its faint glow a stark contrast to the chaos around me. I placed it on the ground, covering it partially with leaves before retreating back toward the cabin. My heart pounded as I moved, the sound of footsteps and voices drawing closer. "You're almost there," I whispered to myself, willing my legs to keep moving. I slipped back into the cabin, my chest heaving with the effort. "It's done," I said, my voice barely audible. Dad nodded, his hazel eyes meeting mine. "Good," he said. "Now we move." Ethan opened the back door, motioning for us to follow. The sound of the helicopters shifted, their searchlights moving toward the beacon's location. The diversion was working, but we knew it wouldn't last long. As we slipped into the darkness of the forest, the sound of shouting and helicopters faded behind us. For now we had escape. But as I clutched the hard drive in my pocket, the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on me. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of the fallout. And as we moved deeper into the shadows, I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The forest was alive with sound, branches cracking underfoot, the distant hum of helicopters, and the faint shouts of agents combing the area. The beacon had done its job, pulling Gulfstream's forces toward the edge of the woods, but the reprieve was temporary. We moved quickly, our breaths fogging in the cold air as we navigated the dense underbrush. The hard drive in my pocket felt like a lifeline, its weight a constant reminder of the stakes. If we were caught, everything we'd sacrificed would mean nothing. Dad led the way, his movements deliberate as he scanned the path ahead. "Stay close," he said, his hazel eyes sharp. His salt and pepper hair glinted faintly in the moonlight as he motioned for us to keep low. Ethan followed closely behind, his blue eyes scanning our surroundings for any sign of danger. Liam was next, his light brown eyes wide with fear but his steps steady. I brought up the rear, every instinct on high alert. The sound of a twig snapping nearby made my heart race. I froze, gripping the flashlight in my pocket as I strained to hear. "Did you hear that?" Liam whispered, his voice trembling. Dad motioned for silence, his hand hovering near the small knife strapped to his belt. The seconds stretched into eternity as we waited, the forest holding its breath with us. Then, from the distance, the faint sound of footsteps reached us, too close for comfort. "Move," Dad said, his voice barely above a whisper. We started running, our footsteps muffled by the thick layer of leaves and moss. The trees blurred around me as I focused on keeping up, the cold air stinging my lungs. The hard drive bounced in my pocket with each step, its presence a stark reminder of what we were fighting for. Ahead of me, Liam stumbled, but Ethan caught his arm, steadying him before he could fall. "Keep going," Ethan urged, his voice firm but kind. "We're almost there." The trail began to slope downward, the ground uneven and treacherous. I nearly lost my footing as we descended, my hands brushing against tree trunks for balance. The sound of pursuit grew louder, the agent's shouts cutting through the night. They were closing in, and the thought sent a surge of panic through me. "We can't let them catch us," I thought, the mantra driving me forward. We reached the bottom of the slope, where a narrow creek wound its way through the forest. Dad motioned for us to cross, stepping into the icy water without hesitation. The cold bit at my skin as I followed, the current tugging at my legs. Liam hesitated, his light brown eyes darting between the water and the path behind us. "You can do this," I said, grabbing his hand and pulling him forward. His grip was tight, but he didn't resist. As we climbed the opposite bank, the sound of footsteps on the slope behind us grew louder. "They're right behind us," Ethan said, his blue eyes narrowing. Dad looked around. His jaw clenched as he scanned the area. "We need to slow them down," he said. He grabbed a large branch, placing it strategically across the trail to create an obstacle. It wouldn't stop them, but it might buy us a few precious seconds. We continued moving, the forest growing denser as we pushed deeper. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but I refused to stop. The hard drive in my pocket felt like a beacon, its importance outweighing the pain. Ethan stayed close, his presence a steadying force as we navigated the twisting paths. "Just a little farther," Dad said, his voice carrying a hint of hope. "There's a ridge ahead, we can regroup there." The ridge came into view, its steep incline illuminated by faint beams of moonlight. We scrambled upward, using roots and rocks for support. The climb was brutal, my hands and knees scraped raw by the rough terrain. Liam struggled, his movements slow and labored, but Ethan stayed with him, offering a helping hand when needed. "You've got this," Ethan said, his voice calm but encouraging. "Just keep going." At the top of the ridge, we collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. The forest stretched out below us, the faint beams of flashlights moving through the trees like restless spirits. "They're still searching," Dad said, his hazel eyes fixed on the scene below. His voice was calm, but the tension in his posture was impossible to miss. "We've bought ourselves some time, but it won't last." Alan's absence weighed heavily on me as I looked out at the forest. His sacrifice had given us this chance, but the cost was almost too much to bear. I reached into my pocket, pulling out the hard drive and holding it tightly. "We can't let this be for nothing," I said, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. Dad placed a hand on my shoulder, his expression both proud and resolute. "We won't," he said. "This isn't over yet." As we caught our breath on the ridge, the faint sound of helicopters returned, their searchlights cutting through the trees in the distance. Gulfstream wasn't giving up, and neither were we. The fight was far from over, and as I tucked the hard drive back into my pocket, I knew one thing for certain. The truth was out there, but the battle to protect it was just beginning. The ridge provided a fleeting sense of safety, but I knew it was an illusion. Below us, Gulfstream's agents were combing the forest, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like blades. The faint hum of helicopters echoed in the distance, a reminder of how relentless they were. We had bought ourselves time, but not much. Every second felt like a ticking clock, counting down to our discovery. Dad crouched near the edge of the ridge, his hazel eyes scanning the forest below. "They're moving west," he said, his voice low but steady. "If we stay quiet and stick to the eastern trail, we might be able to slip past them." His calm tone steadied my nerves, even as my chest tightened with fear. I nodded, gripping the hard drive in my pocket as if it could anchor me to the moment. Liam sat nearby, his light brown eyes darting between us and the forest below. "What if they come up here?" he asked, his voice trembling. Ethan placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, his blue eyes calm but firm. "If they do, we'll deal with it," he said. "But right now we need to focus on moving forward." His words carried a quiet confidence that made me feel like, somehow we could survive this. Alan's absence was a heavy weight on all of us. His sacrifice had bought us this chance, but the cost was impossible to ignore. I could still hear his voice in my mind, urging me to keep going, to finish what we started. The thought gave me strength, but it also filled me with a sense of responsibility that was almost overwhelming. "You can do this," I told myself, forcing the doubt away. "Let's move," Dad said, his voice breaking through my thoughts. He led the way along the eastern trail, his movements careful but purposeful. The ground was uneven, covered in roots and rocks that threatened to trip us with every step. I followed close behind, my hazel eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Liam and Ethan brought up the rear, their footsteps quiet but steady. We hadn't gone far when the sound of a helicopter grew louder, its searchlight sweeping dangerously close to the ridge. My heart raced as we crouched behind a cluster of rocks, the beam passing just feet from where we hid. "Stay down," Dad whispered, his voice barely audible. The tension was suffocating as we waited, every second stretching into an eternity. When the helicopter finally moved on, I let out a shaky breath, my hands trembling. "They're getting closer," Ethan said, his blue eyes narrowing as he glanced back toward the forest below. Dad nodded, his expression grim. "We need to pick up the pace," he said. "If they catch us on this ridge, we're trapped." His words sent a surge of urgency through me, and I forced myself to push past the exhaustion that weighed on my limbs. The trail narrowed as we moved, the steep drop on one side a constant reminder of how precarious our situation was. The moonlight barely illuminated the path, and I had to focus on every step to avoid slipping. Liam stumbled, his light brown eyes wide with fear as Ethan caught his arm. "I've got you," Ethan said, his voice calm but firm. "Just keep moving." We reached a bend in the trail where the ridge widened slightly, offering a better vantage point. Dad stopped, his hazel eyes scanning the forest below. "They're splitting up," he said, his voice low. "Some are heading toward the beacon, but the rest are circling around. They're trying to cut us off." The news sent a chill through me, but Dad's calm demeanor kept me grounded. "We'll have to double back," he said, motioning for us to follow. Just as we turned to retrace our steps, the sound of voices reached us. My chest tightened as I realized the agents had found our trail. "They're up here," one of them shouted, his voice cutting through the night. The tension snapped like a rubber band, and we moved quickly, our footsteps muffled by the dirt and leaves. The hard drive in my pocket felt like a burning weight, its importance fueling my determination. The trail led us to a small outcropping of rocks, where we took cover. Dad motioned for silence, his hazel eyes sharp as he assessed our options. "We can use the ridge to our advantage," he said, his voice calm but decisive. "If we can lead them into a bottleneck, we can slow them down." His plan made sense, but the thought of confronting the agents head-on filled me with dread. I glanced at Ethan, whose blue eyes met mine with quiet determination. "We've got this," he said, his voice steady. As the sound of footsteps grew louder, I clutched the hard drive tightly, the weight of our mission pressing down on me. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about finishing what Alan had started. The ridge felt like both a sanctuary and a trap, its narrow paths offering little room for error. But as I looked at my family, their faces filled with resolve, I knew one thing for certain: we weren't going down without a fight. The ridge was silent except for the sound of our breathing, shallow and ragged. Every shadow seemed alive, every gust of wind carrying with it the threat of discovery. Gulfstream's agents were closing in, their flashlights cutting through the darkness below. The weight of the hard drive in my pocket felt heavier with every passing second, its presence a reminder of why we couldn't afford to fail. Alan's sacrifice had brought us this far, but it was up to us to finish what he started. Dad crouched behind a large boulder, his hazel eyes scanning the path ahead. "They're spreading out," he said, his voice low but steady. "If they reach the bottleneck before us, we're trapped." Ethan knelt beside him, his blue eyes sharp as he studied the trail. "We need to draw them in," he said. "If we can control the choke point, we can buy ourselves time." His calm tone steadied my nerves, even as my chest tightened with fear. Liam sat a few feet away, his light brown eyes wide with worry. "What if they don't fall for it?" he whispered, his voice trembling. I moved closer to him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "They will," I said, trying to project a confidence I didn't feel. "We just have to stick together." My words seemed to ease his fear, but the doubt lingered in his gaze. Dad motioned for us to move, his posture tense but controlled. We stayed low, moving silently along the ridge toward the bottleneck. The narrow path was treacherous, the steep drop on one side a constant reminder of how little room we had for error. My heart pounded as I followed, every step deliberate, every sound amplified by the stillness of the night. As we reached the choke point, Dad signaled for us to stop. The path ahead narrowed into a natural corridor, flanked by steep rock walls on either side. It was the perfect place to slow the agents down, but it also meant we would have to hold our ground. "This is it," Dad said, his hazel eyes meeting mine. "We hold them here." His calm determination was both reassuring and terrifying. Ethan took position near the entrance to the bottleneck, his blue eyes scanning the darkness. "They're close," he said, his voice low but urgent. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps growing louder, the agents' voices echoing off the rock walls. My chest tightened as I gripped the hard drive in my pocket, its weight grounding me in the moment. This is for Alan, I thought, the mantra giving me strength. Liam stayed behind me, his small frame trembling as he clutched a flashlight. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice barely audible. I glanced back at him, my hazel eyes meeting his light brown ones. "Stay low and stay quiet," I said. "We'll get through this." He nodded, his fear evident but his resolve unwavering. I turned my attention back to the path, my heart pounding as the first beam of light appeared. The lead agent stepped into view, his silhouette outlined by the glow of his flashlight. He moved cautiously, his weapon raised as he scanned the corridor. Behind him, more agents appeared, their movements coordinated and deliberate. Dad waited until they were fully inside the bottleneck before making his move. With a quick motion, he dislodged a pile of rocks from the ridge above, sending them tumbling down onto the agents below. The sudden noise startled the agents, their shouts echoing through the corridor as they scrambled to avoid the falling debris. Ethan took advantage of the chaos, moving swiftly to block their advance with a makeshift barricade of branches and rocks. The agents regrouped quickly, their flashlights casting erratic beams of light as they tried to regain control. "Stay back," one of them shouted, his voice filled with authority. But it was clear they were caught off guard. Dad signaled for us to retreat further up the trail, his movements precise and controlled. We moved quickly, the sound of the agents' shouts growing fainter as the barricades slowed their progress. My chest heaved with exertion, but I refused to stop. The hard drive in my pocket felt like a lifeline, its presence a constant reminder of what was at stake. "Keep going," I told myself, the mantra pushing me forward. As we reached a higher vantage point, the sound of footsteps echoed below. The agents were relentless, their determination matching our own. Dad and Ethan worked quickly to set up another defensive position, their movements efficient despite the tension. "This won't hold them for long," Ethan said, his blue eyes meeting Dad's. "We need to keep moving." Dad nodded, his expression grim but resolute. "Let's go," he said, motioning for us to follow. As we disappeared further into the forest, the sound of the agents breaking through the barricade echoed behind us. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. And as I clutched the hard drive, the weight of our mission pressing down on me, I knew one thing for certain. We couldn't stop now. Not when the truth was finally within reach. The night felt endless, the darkness pressing in on all sides as we pushed further into the forest. Every sound seemed amplified, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, each one a reminder that Gulfstream's agents were close behind. The ridge had given us a momentary advantage, but the realization that they were closing in again filled me with a mix of fear and urgency. The hard drive in my pocket felt heavier than ever, its weight a constant reminder of everything we'd sacrificed to get this far. Dad led the way, his hazel eyes scanning the dense underbrush ahead. His movements were deliberate, his posture tense but composed. "We're heading for the old logging roads," he said, his voice low but firm. "If we can make it there, we might have a chance to lose them." His calm demeanor gave me a thread of hope to cling to, even as my legs burned with exhaustion. Liam stumbled beside me, his light brown eyes wide with fear. "I don't think I can keep going," he said, his voice trembling. I placed a hand on his shoulder, steadying him. "You can," I said, my tone firm but gentle. We're almost there. The truth was, I didn't know how much farther we had to go, but I couldn't let him give up. Not now. Not when we were so close. Ethan brought up the rear, his blue eyes sharp as he watched for any signs of pursuit. "They're still on our trail," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to pick up the pace." Dad nodded, motioning for us to keep moving. The sound of distant voices reached us, faint but unmistakable. They were getting closer. The terrain grew rougher as we descended from the ridge, the uneven ground threatening to trip us with every step. I focused on the path ahead, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The thought of Alan, of what he had sacrificed, fueled my determination. "We can't let this be for nothing," I told myself, the mantra pushing me forward. Finally, we reached a clearing where the forest opened up to reveal the remnants of an old logging road. The dirt path was overgrown with weeds, the faded tracks barely visible in the moonlight. "This is it," Dad said, his voice tinged with relief. "If we follow this road, it should lead us to the safe house." His words gave me a glimmer of hope, but the sound of footsteps behind us quickly extinguished it. "They're here," Ethan said, his voice urgent. Dad turned to face us, his hazel eyes sharp. "We need a distraction," he said. His gaze shifted to a pile of fallen branches nearby. "Help me set this up," he said, motioning to Ethan. Together, they began constructing a makeshift barricade, their movements swift and efficient. "This won't stop them, but it'll slow them down," Dad said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. Liam and I kept watch, our eyes scanning the darkness for any signs of movement. The faint glow of flashlights in the distance made my chest tighten. "They're getting closer," Liam whispered, his voice trembling. I placed a reassuring hand on his arm, my own fear threatening to overwhelm me. "We'll be okay," I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. As Dad and Ethan finished the barricade, the sound of footsteps grew louder. "Go," Dad said, motioning for us to move down the road. "We'll catch up." I hesitated, my gaze shifting between him and the path ahead. "We're not leaving you," I said, my voice firm. Dad gave me a small, reassuring smile. "We'll be right behind you," he said. "Just go." Reluctantly, Liam and I began moving down the road, my heart pounding with every step. The sound of the agents breaking through the barricade reached us, their voices filled with urgency. I glanced back, my chest tightening as I saw Dad and Ethan retreating toward us. "Keep moving," Dad shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. We pushed forward, the logging road narrowing as it twisted deeper into the forest. The sound of pursuit was relentless, the agents' voices growing louder with every passing second. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I refused to stop. The hard drive in my pocket was our only leverage, our only chance at exposing the truth. "Just a little farther," I told myself, the mantra keeping me focused. As we rounded a bend in the road, the faint outline of a structure came into view. My chest tightened with a mix of relief and fear. The safe house was close, but so were Gulfstream's agents. The fight wasn't over, not yet. And as I glanced back at my family, their faces filled with determination, I knew one thing for certain: we weren't going down without a fight. The sight of the safe house on the horizon brought a flicker of hope, but it was fleeting. The voices of Gulfstream's agents echoed behind us, their relentless pursuit cutting through the stillness of the forest. My legs burned, my chest heaved, but the thought of safety just within reach kept me moving. The hard drive in my pocket felt heavier than ever, a constant reminder of what we were fighting for. Every step forward was a battle against the fear clawing at my resolve. "We're close," Dad said, his hazel eyes fixed on the faint outline of the cabin ahead. His voice was steady, but the tension in his posture was unmistakable. He turned to Ethan, his expression resolute. "We need to buy more time," he said. Ethan nodded, his blue eyes scanning the dense underbrush for anything they could use. "There's a clearing just up ahead," Ethan said. "If we set up a diversion, it might slow them down enough for us to reach the cabin." Liam clung to my arm, his light brown eyes wide with fear. "What if they catch us?" he asked, his voice trembling. I knelt down, placing my hands on his shoulders, forcing him to meet my gaze. "They won't," I said, my voice firm despite the fear gnawing at the edges of my resolve. "We've come too far to give up now. We're going to make it." My words seemed to steady him, but the doubt lingered in his eyes. Dad and Ethan worked quickly, gathering branches and rocks to create a makeshift barrier in the clearing. The sound of footsteps grew louder, the agents' flashlights casting eerie beams of light through the trees. "Hurry," Dad said, his voice low but urgent. Every movement was deliberate, every second critical. The barrier wouldn't stop the agents, but it would slow them down, if only for a moment. As the diversion took shape, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest felt alive with shadows, each one seeming to shift and move as if following our every step. My chest tightened as I scanned the darkness, my fingers brushing against the hard drive in my pocket. "Keep going," I told myself, the mantra steadying my nerves. "It's done," Ethan said, stepping back to survey their work. Dad nodded, his hazel eyes sharp as he motioned for us to move. "Stick to the trees," he said, his voice low but commanding. "Stay low and keep quiet." We moved quickly, the dense forest providing a semblance of cover. The cabin grew closer with every step, but so did the sound of pursuit. The agents were relentless, their determination mirroring our own. We reached the edge of the clearing where the cabin stood, its dark silhouette barely visible against the night sky. My chest tightened as I took in the sight. The safe house was small and unassuming, its windows shuttered, its door slightly ajar. It looked abandoned, but I knew better than to trust appearances. "Stay here," Dad said, his voice firm as he motioned for Ethan to follow him. "We'll check it out." Liam and I crouched near the tree-line, the shadows wrapping around us like a protective cloak. My heart pounded as I watched Dad and Ethan approach the cabin, their movements cautious but purposeful. The sound of rustling leaves behind me made my breath catch in my throat. I turned quickly, my hazel eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. "What is it?" Liam whispered, his voice trembling. "Probably just the wind," I said, though I wasn't convinced. Dad signaled for us to approach, his expression unreadable. "It's clear," he said, stepping aside to let us in. The cabin was sparse but functional, a single room with a cot, a small table, and a lantern casting a faint glow. Alan's laptop sat on the table, its screen dim but still active. Relief washed over me as I stepped inside, but it was short-lived. The sound of vehicles approaching shattered the fragile calm. "They're here," Ethan said, his blue eyes narrowing as he moved to the window. Dad locked the door, his movements swift and precise. "We'll hold them off," he said, his voice steady. He turned to me, his hazel eyes filled with determination. "Linda, you need to secure the files." My chest tightened as I nodded, moving quickly to the laptop. The progress bar on the screen showed the upload was nearly complete, but it wasn't fast enough. Liam stayed close, his light brown eyes filled with fear as he watched me work. "What do we do if they get in?" he asked, his voice trembling. I glanced at him, my hands steady despite the chaos around us. "They won't," I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. The sound of footsteps outside grew louder, the agents closing in. Every second felt like an eternity. As the first beam of a flashlight pierced through the cabin window, I knew we were out of time. The upload was at 95%, the progress bar crawling forward agonizingly slowly. Dad and Ethan braced themselves near the door, their postures tense but resolute. Liam clung to my arm, his fear palpable. The fight wasn't over, not yet. And as the door shuddered under the weight of the first blow, I realized one thing. We were down to our last chance. The cabin door shuddered under the force of the first blow, the sound reverberating through the small space like a thunderclap. My chest tightened as I glanced at the progress bar on Alan's laptop. 96%. The files were almost uploaded, but almost wasn't enough. Dad and Ethan braced themselves against the door, their expressions tense but resolute. Liam stayed close to me, his light brown eyes wide with fear as he clutched my arm. The weight of the hard drive in my pocket felt like a lifeline, but it also felt like a target. "They're trying to breach the door," Dad said, his voice calm despite the tension in his posture. He glanced at Ethan, his hazel eyes sharp. "We need to hold them off long enough for the upload to finish." Ethan nodded, his blue eyes narrowing as he adjusted his grip on the wooden plank he had picked up as a makeshift weapon. "We can do this," he said, his voice steady. His confidence was like a beacon in the storm, grounding me even as fear clawed at my resolve. The next blow splintered the door, the wood cracking under the pressure. Liam let out a small cry, his fingers digging into my arm. "It's okay," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound reassuring. I placed a hand on his shoulder, my hazel eyes meeting his light brown ones. "Stay behind me, okay? We're going to be fine." My words felt hollow, but I had to believe them. I had to make him believe them. The sound of glass shattering made me turn sharply. One of the cabin windows had been broken, a flashlight beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. Ethan moved quickly, using the plank to block the window as another beam of light appeared. "They're coming in from all sides," he said, his voice low but urgent. Dad nodded, his jaw tightening. "We'll hold them here," he said. "Linda, focus on the upload." I turned my attention back to the laptop, my fingers flying over the keyboard as I ensured the encryption was holding. 97%. The progress bar inched forward, every second feeling like an eternity. My chest tightened as the sound of footsteps on the roof reached my ears. They were everywhere, closing in like a predator circling its prey. I glanced at Dad, whose hazel eyes met mine with quiet determination. "You've got this," he said. His words steadied me, even as the cabin shook with the force of another blow. Ethan let out a grunt as he used the plank to push back an agent trying to climb through the broken window. "They're getting bolder," he said, his voice strained. Dad moved to help him, his movements controlled but urgent. "Stay focused," he called to me, his voice cutting through the chaos. I nodded, my hands trembling as I turned back to the laptop. 98%. The door finally gave way, splintering as an agent burst through. Dad reacted instantly, using a broken chair leg to block the agent's advance. The two struggled, their movements a blur as Ethan moved to help. "Go!" Dad shouted, his voice filled with urgency. "Finish the upload." My chest tightened as I turned back to the laptop, forcing myself to block out the sounds of the fight behind me. 99%. The sound of footsteps behind me made me freeze. I turned to see another agent climbing through the window, his flashlight illuminating the room. Liam let out a small cry, and I moved quickly, grabbing a nearby lamp and swinging it with all my strength. The agent stumbled, his flashlight clattering to the floor. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. The laptop let out a soft chime, signaling the upload was complete. Relief surged through me as the progress bar filled, the files finally out in the world. But the relief was short-lived. The sound of more agents approaching filled the air, their voices loud and commanding. Dad and Ethan were struggling to hold them back, their movements growing slower with each passing second. "We need to go," I shouted, grabbing the hard drive and slipping it into my pocket. Dad glanced at me, his expression a mix of relief and urgency. "Out the back," he said, motioning for us to move. Ethan nodded, his blue eyes meeting mine. "We'll cover you," he said. His words sent a chill through me, but I didn't argue. I grabbed Liam's hand, pulling him toward the back door as Dad and Ethan held their ground. The back door opened to the dense forest, the darkness wrapping around us like a protective cloak. "Run!" Dad shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Liam and I sprinted into the trees, the sound of the fight behind us growing fainter with every step. My chest heaved as I pushed forward, my legs burning with effort. The hard drive in my pocket felt like a lifeline, its presence a reminder of what we had accomplished, but also of what we had lost. As the forest swallowed us, the sound of footsteps and voices faded into the distance. For now we were safe. But as I clutched the hard drive, the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on me. The files were out there, but so was Gulfstream. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. And as the faint glow of dawn broke over the horizon, I knew one thing for certain. We had won this battle, but the war was far from over.